Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first thing you learn about southern Georgia swampland is that it breathes differently than anywhere else on Earth. The air hangs thick and heavy, pregnant with moisture that seeps through your clothes and settles in your lungs like a living thing. When I bought those 43 acres of soggy earth and Spanish moss, the realtor warned me about the wildlife, the flooding, the isolation. She never mentioned how the land itself would watch me. I'd driven down from Atlanta with nothing but a duffel bag and a bank account that had finally recovered from the divorce. The property sat at the end of a dirt road that disappeared into cypress groves and shallow marshes, the kind of place where cell towers feared to tread. Perfect for a man who needed to disappear for a while, to think without the constant buzz of civilization crawling under his skin. The cabin was a disaster: rotting floorboards, a roof that leaked like a sieve, and plumbing that belonged in a museum. But it had walls and a stone fireplace that still drew air, which was more than I'd had in months of sleeping in my car. I spent the first week just making it livable, hammering boards and patching holes while the swamp orchestra played its endless symphony of insects, frogs, and things I couldn't identify. It was during the second week that I first saw him. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to make the surrounding darkness feel solid and impenetrable. I'd been staring into the coals, letting my mind drift, when something shifted in my peripheral vision. Not movement exactly, more like a rearrangement of shadows that shouldn't have been possible. I turned my head slowly, the way you do when you're not sure you want to see what's there. 20 feet away, just at the edge of the firelight's reach, something sat watching me. At first glance, it looked like a massive dog, the kind of pit bull you see in those underground fighting rings, all muscle and intimidation. But dogs don't sit that still, don't hold their heads at that precise angle, don't watch with that kind of intelligence burning behind their eyes. The thing, because I couldn't bring myself to call it a dog, had the build of a heavyweight boxer compressed into a quadruped frame. Its shoulders rolled with muscle that seemed to shift and flow even when perfectly still. The head was broad and flat, with ears that pricked forward like satellite dishes tracking a signal. But it was the eyes that made my mouth go dry. They reflected the dying firelight with an intensity that seemed to come from within, as if something luminous lived behind them. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, without any sound of preparation, no intake of breath, no shifting of weight, it moved. The distance between us vanished in a heartbeat. One moment it was sitting at the fire's edge. The next it was bounding across the clearing in long, impossible strides that covered the ground with fluid grace. I blinked, and it had reached the tree line 50 feet away. Another blink, and it was gone, leaving only the swaying of low branches to mark its passage. No panting, no rustling of leaves, no snapping of twigs under heavy paws. Nothing. I sat there for the rest of the night, feeding logs to the fire and telling myself I'd imagined it all. Fatigue, isolation, too much cheap whiskey. Any combination could explain what I thought I'd seen. But when dawn came and I examined the ground where the thing had been sitting, I found impressions in the soft earth. Not paw prints exactly, but depressions that suggested weight distributed in ways that didn't match any animal I knew. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me through engineering school and 20 years of building bridges, insisted I was losing it. The other part, the primitive core that still remembered when humans were prey, whispered that something was hunting me. I drove into town that afternoon and bought supplies. Hardware store first, fluorescent paint, wooden stakes, a digital timer with a humidity sensor. The elderly clerk looked at my purchases with raised eyebrows, but didn't ask questions. Small-town folks understood the value of minding their own business. That evening, I set up my experiment. 20 stakes driven into the ground in a rough circle around the clearing, each one painted with bright orange fluorescent that would glow under any decent light source. The timer went on a stump near the fire pit, programmed to record humidity levels throughout the night. Then I waited. The creature returned on the third night. This time I was ready. I'd positioned myself with my back to the cabin wall, giving me a clear view of the entire clearing. The fire burned low, just enough to provide ambient light without destroying my night vision. The humidity gauge read 87%. Close, but not quite at the threshold I'd been tracking. Movement caught my eye around midnight. Not the bold approach of our first encounter, but something more cautious, more deliberate. It emerged from the tree line like smoke given form, sliding between the stakes with an awareness that suggested it knew exactly what they were for. The creature circled the clearing twice, always staying just outside the ring of stakes, studying them with obvious intelligence. Each time it passed near the timer, the device emitted a soft beep. 88%, 89, 90. The moment the humidity crossed that threshold, everything changed. The air itself seemed to thicken, taking on a weight and presence that pressed against my skin. A mist began to rise from the ground. Not the normal fog you'd expect in a swamp, but something that moved with purpose, flowing in streams and eddies that defied the still air. And in that mist, between the stakes, arcing impressions began to appear in the soft earth. Not footprints, curved gouges in the soil, as if something heavy had compressed the ground in long, sweeping patterns. The marks appeared in sequence, one after another, tracing a path that spiraled inward toward the center of the clearing where I sat. The creature never moved. It remained at the tree line, watching, while the marks drew closer and closer to my position. That's when I understood. The thing I was seeing wasn't what was making the tracks. It was something else entirely, something that used the humidity, the temperature differential between the cooling ground and the warmer air, to move in ways that bypassed normal physics. The creature was just the observer, the herald, the spotter. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Instead, I researched everything I could about thermal dynamics, about the behavior of gases and moisture and temperature gradients. The science was there, buried in obscure papers about atmospheric anomalies and unexplained meteorological phenomena. References to thermal inversion displacement and localized pressure differentials that could theoretically allow something to use temperature variations as a form of locomotion. But the papers all carried the same warning. Such phenomena were unstable, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous to anything caught in their path. That's when I came up with a plan. Thermal reflective tarps, the kind used by emergency responders to retain body heat, arranged in specific patterns around the clearing. If the thing was using temperature differences to navigate, I could create false thermal signatures, phantom hotspots and cold zones that would confuse its navigation system, make it misjudge distances and angles. The idea was to create a thermal maze, forcing it to miscalculate its approach and land somewhere I could observe it more closely. Maybe even communicate with it, if communication was possible. I should have considered what would happen if I succeeded. The tarps went up on a Thursday, silver rectangles suspended between trees and stakes, arranged in overlapping patterns that would create complex thermal shadows across the clearing. I'd spent days calculating angles and positions, using every trick I'd learned about heat transfer and reflection. The creature returned that same night, earlier than usual. It approached the modified clearing with obvious confusion, pacing along the tree line while the mist began to form. The humidity climbed toward 90%, and the familiar arcing marks began to appear in the soil. But this time, they were wrong. The impressions curved and twisted in impossible directions, doubling back on themselves, creating spiral patterns that seemed to trap whatever was making them in increasingly tight circles. The marks grew deeper, more frantic, as if the invisible presence was struggling against something it couldn't understand. The creature at the tree line began to pace faster, its breathing visible in the cool air. For the first time since I'd been watching it, the thing showed signs of agitation. Its head swiveled back and forth, tracking movement I couldn't see, and a low sound emerged from its throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine. The thermal impressions spiraled inward, faster now, converging on the center of the clearing where I sat. But they were off course, confused by the reflected heat signatures. Whatever intelligence guided them was struggling to compensate for the false readings. 20 feet away, 15, 10. The marks were almost on top of me when something went wrong. The spiral pattern suddenly reversed, the impressions racing outward from the center in an explosion of curved gouges. The mist that had been rising from the ground suddenly collapsed, falling back to earth with an almost audible sigh. And in that moment of confusion, of thermal chaos, something materialized in the clearing. Not the creature. That was still at the tree line, now backing away with obvious alarm. This was something else entirely. A distortion in the air itself, like heat shimmer made solid, roughly human-shaped but wrong in ways that made my eyes water to look at it. It stood in the center of my thermal maze, turning slowly, as if trying to orient itself. Where it stepped, the grass withered and the ground steamed. The fluorescent paint on the nearest stakes began to bubble and run, dripping like melted wax. The thing that looked like a massive dog had begun to retreat into the trees, but the distortion turned toward it with sudden interest. It took a step, then another, moving with the same impossible speed I'd witnessed before. But now I could see how it worked. The air around it warped and bent, temperature differentials creating pockets of pressure that launched it forward in great bounding leaps. It was hunting the creature, had been hunting it all along. The dog thing broke into a run, crashing through the undergrowth with the first sounds I'd ever heard it make. Behind it, the distortion gave chase, moving in those weird, stuttering jumps that covered distance faster than anything natural had a right to. They disappeared into the swamp, leaving me alone in a clearing that now reeked of ozone and burned earth. I packed that night, threw everything into the car and drove north without stopping, telling myself I was having a breakdown, that the isolation and stress had finally cracked something fundamental in my mind. It was easier to believe I was crazy than to accept what I'd seen. But sometimes, late at night in my Atlanta apartment, I wonder about that dog-like creature, whether it was trying to warn me about what lived in the thermal layers above the swamp, whether it had been protecting me from something that hunted by temperature, by the warmth of living flesh, whether it's still running. The property is still mine, according to the tax records. 43 acres of swampland that I'll never see again. Sometimes I get curious about what the new sensors would show, what patterns might emerge in the humidity data if I were brave enough to return. But I'm not brave. I'm practical. And practical men don't go looking for things that hunt in the spaces between warm and cold, that use the very air as a highway to travel impossible distances in impossible time. The thermal reflective tarps are probably still there, hanging between the trees like silver prayers. I hope they're enough to keep whatever I accidentally summoned confused, disoriented, trapped in loops of false readings and phantom heat signatures. I hope the dog thing got away. Most of all, I hope I never find out. Story 2. The first thing you need to understand about living on Hickory Ridge Road is that cell service dies exactly 43 feet from my front porch. I've measured it. Not 42, not 44. 43 feet, right where the driveway meets the asphalt, where the shale bedrock gives way to clay deposits that stretch down toward the Mohawk Valley like fingers of some buried hand. I moved here 3 months ago, trading my studio apartment in Albany for this weathered colonial that sits between abandoned apple orchards and rolling hills that turn the color of rust come October. The isolation suited me after the divorce, after the job, after everything that made staying in the city feel like drowning in shallow water. Out here, the silence has weight. It presses against the windows at night and settles in the corners of rooms like dust. But silence, I've learned, can be broken by things that shouldn't exist. The electromagnetic field detector arrived on a Tuesday, ordered online after the third appearance. The seller's description promised professional-grade sensitivity to EMF fluctuations and anomalous energy patterns. I'd become the kind of person who bought equipment to measure the unmeasurable, who kept detailed logs of temperatures and barometric pressure, who checked and rechecked the batteries in devices that had never failed before. The first time I saw her, I convinced myself she was just another hiker. The hills are cross-hatched with old trails, abandoned property lines, and the remnants of stone walls that once divided farms long since returned to forest. People wander through sometimes. Photographers chasing autumn light. Amateur historians tracking down forgotten cemeteries. Couples looking for privacy. But hikers don't usually stand motionless on a hill for 27 minutes, staring at a house with the focus of someone solving an equation written in a language they're just beginning to understand. She was impossibly thin, like someone had taken a normal-sized person and stretched them until all the soft parts went taut. Her clothes were black, not the fashionable black of city dwellers, but the flat, light-absorbing black of charcoal. Even from my porch, something about her stance seemed wrong, as if she'd learned to stand upright by watching others but hadn't quite mastered the subtle shifts that make a human body look comfortable in its own skin. When I stepped outside to get a better look, the October air bit through my flannel shirt. The leaves on the maples had turned that particular shade of red that looks like dried blood in certain light. She was closer now, just across the narrow road that separates my property from the hillside, but I couldn't remember seeing her move. One moment she'd been a distant figure, the next she stood close enough that I could see her face. That's when I noticed her eyes. They weren't brown or blue or green or any color that belonged to human irises. They were black. Not the black of large pupils in dim light, but the complete black of deep water at night, of subway tunnels between stations, of spaces where light goes to die. Her arm was extended toward me, hand gripping what looked like a cell phone, though the screen remained dark despite her thumb moving across it in small, repetitive gestures. "Excuse me," she called, and her voice carried perfectly across the distance despite being barely above a whisper. "The signal here is really bad. Do you know if there's better reception somewhere else?" I found myself taking a step forward before catching myself. Something about the question felt rehearsed, like dialogue from a play she'd performed many times before. The phone in her hand was an older model, maybe 5 years out of date, and held at an angle that suggested she wasn't actually trying to use it so much as display it. "You might try down by the main road," I called back. "Sometimes there's a bar or two near the intersection." She nodded, but didn't move. Instead, she took a step closer to my driveway, and I noticed that her feet made no sound on the gravel-strewn asphalt. The autumn wind that rustled the dying leaves and sent brown apple leaves skittering across the road didn't seem to touch her clothes or hair. "That's pretty far," she said. "Would it be okay if I tried from your porch? Sometimes elevation helps." The question hung in the air between us like smoke. Something about the way she phrased it, not asking to use my phone, not asking to come inside, but asking for permission to step onto my property, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the October temperature. "I think you'll have better luck down the hill," I said, backing toward my front door. She watched me retreat with those impossible eyes, and for a moment I thought she might argue or press the issue. Instead, she simply nodded again and began walking toward the main road. But as I watched her move, she seemed to fade with each step, becoming less distinct, less present, until she reached the exact spot where my driveway met the road and simply wasn't there anymore. Not gone like someone who'd walked out of sight, gone like someone who'd been edited out of the world between one frame and the next. I stood on my porch for another hour, watching the empty road and trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole encounter. The rational explanations lined up neatly. Stress from the move, isolation playing tricks on my perception, the way twilight can transform familiar shapes into something strange. But when I finally went inside, I found myself checking the locks on both the front and back doors, something I'd never bothered with since moving to the country. The second appearance came 6 days later, on a Sunday morning when the fog lay thick between the hills like spilled milk. I was drinking coffee on the porch, enjoying the way the mist transformed the landscape into something soft and dreamlike, when I noticed a dark vertical line that didn't belong to any tree or fence post. As the fog shifted, the line resolved into her familiar silhouette, standing in exactly the same spot as before. This time I was ready with questions. How had she gotten there without my hearing a car? Why was she dressed the same way, in the same impossible black that seemed to absorb the gray morning light? But before I could call out, she began walking toward my driveway with that same soundless stride. "Hi again," she said when she reached the edge of my property. I was wondering. My car broke down just up the hill. Could I use your phone to call for help? Again, the phrasing struck me as odd. Not asking to come in, not asking to borrow the phone, but asking for permission to use it. And again, something inside me wanted to say yes, wanted to be helpful to this strange woman who'd appeared twice now like a recurring dream. Instead, I pointed toward the main road. There's a gas station about 2 miles that way. They'd be able to help you better than I could. She tilted her head slightly, and I realized I'd never seen her blink. That's pretty far to walk. Are you sure I couldn't just make a quick call? I'm sure, I said, though I wasn't sure of anything anymore. This time I watched more carefully as she turned to leave. Her footsteps were completely silent, and as she moved away from my property, she seemed to lose definition, becoming less solid with each step until she reached the road and dissolved like sugar in water. That afternoon, I drove to the nearest electronics store and bought the electromagnetic field detector. The device was smaller than I'd expected, about the size of a paperback book, with a digital display and a sensor wand that reminded me of the metal detectors people used to search for lost jewelry on beaches. The instruction manual was dense with technical jargon about ambient electromagnetic fields, radio frequency interference, and anomalous energy signatures. But the basic operation was simple enough. Point the sensor, read the display, try not to think too hard about what you were looking for. I spent the next week taking baseline readings around my property. The detector registered the normal electromagnetic signatures of modern life, the power lines running along the road, the wireless router in my house, the cell tower miles away that provided my sketchy internet connection. But when I traced the old telephone line easement that cut across the hillside behind my house, the readings spiked dramatically right at the property line, right where the shale gave way to clay, right where she always disappeared. The easement itself was a relic from the 1950s, when the phone company had strung lines to connect the scattered farms and rural homes that dotted the valley. The poles had been removed decades ago, but the legal right-of-way remained, a 20-foot wide strip of land that belonged to neither my property nor the hillside beyond. According to the county records, it was a jurisdictional gray area, technically owned by the defunct telephone company and maintained by no one. Standing there with the detector in my hand, watching the numbers climb as I approached the exact spot where she always vanished, I began to understand that I was dealing with something that obeyed rules I didn't recognize. The third appearance came during a thunderstorm. I was inside, listening to the rain hammer against the windows and watching lightning illuminate the hillside in stark, brief glimpses. The power had gone out around 9, and I was reading by candlelight when I heard what sounded like someone knocking on the front door. Not the sharp rap of knuckles on wood, but a soft, persistent tapping like fingernails against glass. I grabbed a flashlight and checked the porch, but found it empty. The knocking continued, seeming to come from different parts of the house. First the front door, then the back, then what sounded like the living room windows. Each time I investigated, I found nothing but rain and darkness. Then I saw her standing at the edge of my driveway, perfectly visible despite the storm, her black clothes untouched by the rain that was turning the dirt road into muddy streams. She wasn't knocking on anything. She was simply standing there, that same dark phone in her outstretched hand, waiting. I grabbed the electromagnetic field detector and stepped onto the porch. Even through the storm, the device's readings were off the charts, the digital display flickering between numbers too high for the scale. But as I watched her through the rain, I realized she wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at the detector in my hand. "That's interesting equipment," she called, her voice somehow cutting through the thunder and rain as if she were standing right next to me. "Are you getting good readings?" The question froze me mid-step. How could she know what the device was? How could she be standing in a downpour without getting wet? And why did her voice sound like it was coming from inside my own head? "I was wondering," she continued, "if I could come in out of the rain, just for a few minutes, until it passes." This time, the invitation she was fishing for was completely explicit. Come in. 2 simple words that would grant her access to my house, my space, whatever sanctuary I'd built around myself in this remote corner of New York. I wanted to say yes. Every instinct of hospitality and human decency urged me to open the door to someone caught in a storm. But something deeper, some primitive part of my brain that still remembered when night held real terrors, screamed warnings I didn't want to acknowledge. "The storm should pass soon," I said instead. "You'd probably be better off waiting in your car." She tilted her head again, and lightning illuminated her face in a brief, stark flash. In that instant, I saw that her mouth was smiling, but her black eyes held no expression at all. They looked like holes punched through reality into someplace else entirely. "I don't have a car," she said. "Then how did you get here?" I walked. "From where?" "From there," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the hillside. "From the other side of the line." The line. She knew about the easement, the boundary where the soil changed and the electromagnetic readings spiked and she always disappeared. She knew exactly what separated her from my property, and she was telling me that she'd crossed over from somewhere else entirely. The storm ended as suddenly as it had begun. One moment the rain was drumming against the roof and windows. The next there was only the sound of water dripping from the eaves and the distant rumble of thunder moving off toward the east. When I looked back toward the driveway, she was gone, but the electromagnetic detector was still screaming. Over the following weeks, I began to document everything with the methodical precision of someone building a case for their own sanity. I recorded the exact times of her appearances, the weather conditions, the electromagnetic readings, even the specific words she used in each attempt to gain access to my property. Patterns emerged like constellations slowly becoming visible in a darkening sky. She always appeared on days when the barometric pressure was dropping. She always stood in the same location, at the edge of where my property met the old easement. She always disappeared at exactly the same spot, right where the shale met the clay. And she always asked for permission to cross onto my land using slightly different words but the same essential structure. A request disguised as a reasonable favor. The electromagnetic readings were consistent too. Normal background levels everywhere except for that 20-foot strip of the old telephone easement, where the detector registered energy signatures unlike anything I'd seen. Not the steady hum of electrical devices or the fluctuating patterns of radio waves, but something that pulsed with an almost organic rhythm, as if the earth itself were breathing. I started spending more time researching the history of the area, diving deep into county records and newspaper archives. What I found made the hair on my arms stand up even in the warm cocoon of the public library's reading room. The telephone easement had been established in 1953, cutting across 3 properties to connect the valley to the outside world. But the line had been abandoned in 1967 after a series of technical difficulties that the phone company's records described only as persistent interference from unknown sources. More interesting were the incident reports I found buried in the local newspaper's archives. Starting in 1968, just a year after the phone line was decommissioned, there had been a steady trickle of strange reports from people living along the old easement. Residents complained of persistent knocking sounds, phone calls from numbers that didn't exist, and encounters with people who asked to use their phones or come inside during bad weather. The reports continued sporadically through the 1970s and 80s, then stopped completely in 1995. I cross-referenced the dates with property records and found that the last report had been filed just a month before the final house along the easement had been abandoned and eventually torn down. My house, the one I'd thought I'd bought for its isolation and peace, was the first occupied dwelling along the old telephone easement in over 25 years. The realization should have sent me packing, should have had me calling real estate agents and putting the house back on the market. Instead, it only deepened my fascination with the woman in black and her persistent, polite attempts to cross the invisible boundary that seemed to hold her at bay. I began to experiment. During her 4th appearance, I tried engaging her in longer conversation, asking questions about where she'd come from and where she was going. Her answers were always vague but internally consistent. She was visiting friends in the area. She was traveling through. She'd been staying at a house just up the hill that I knew didn't exist. When I pressed for specifics, she always redirected the conversation back to her need, to use my phone, to wait out the weather, to step onto my porch for just a moment. During the 5th appearance, I tested the boundaries more directly. I walked to the very edge of my driveway, right up to the line where the electromagnetic reading spiked, and observed her reaction. She became more animated as I approached, her voice more urgent in its politeness, but she never stepped any closer to my property. It was as if an invisible wall stood between us, one that she couldn't cross but desperately wanted to. "You could just take one step forward," I said during that encounter. "It's not like there's a fence or anything." "I need to be invited," she replied, and for the first time, her careful politeness slipped enough to reveal something like frustration underneath. "Just say I can come over. Just say yes." I didn't say yes. I couldn't. Some instinct deeper than logic kept the word locked behind my teeth, and after a few more minutes of increasingly desperate pleasantries, she faded away at the boundary line just as she always did. But her words stuck with me. I need to be invited. It suggested rules, limitations, some kind of supernatural etiquette that governed her existence. The folklore was full of stories about entities that couldn't enter homes without permission, creatures bound by the laws of hospitality and invitation. But those were just stories, weren't they? Fairy tales and superstitions from a time when people needed explanations for things they didn't understand. Except I was living with something I didn't understand, measuring it with devices that registered its presence, documenting its behavior with the persistence of a scientist studying a new species. And every measurement, every observation, every carefully recorded detail pointed to the same impossible conclusion. She was real. She was constrained by rules that made no sense in the modern world, and she wanted something from me that I was terrified to give. The sixth appearance came on Halloween night. I'd been expecting her, had spent the evening on my porch with the electromagnetic detector and a thermos of coffee, watching the empty road and waiting for the familiar spike in readings that announced her presence. The irony wasn't lost on me. Halloween, the night when the boundary between worlds was supposed to be thinnest, and I was sitting in the dark waiting for a woman who might not be a woman at all. She materialized just after midnight, not gradually becoming visible like before, but simply stepping into existence as if she'd walked through a door I couldn't see. This time, she didn't stop at the edge of the road. She walked directly to the property line, close enough that I could see the complete absence of expression in her black eyes, close enough to notice that she cast no shadow despite the full moon overhead. "Happy Halloween," she said, and her voice carried a note of what might have been humor. Appropriate night for this kind of conversation, don't you think? "What kind of conversation?" I asked. "The kind where we stop pretending you don't know what I am." The words hit me like cold water. For weeks, I'd been documenting and measuring and analyzing, maintaining the fiction that this was some kind of natural phenomenon I could eventually understand and explain. But standing there in the moonlight, with the electromagnetic detector screaming warnings in my hand, I couldn't pretend anymore. "What are you?" I asked. "I'm someone who needs an invitation," she said. "Someone who's been waiting a very long time for the right person to move into the right house at the right spot along an old boundary line." Waiting for what? To cross over, to step off this easement and into the world of the living. The world of the living. The phrase confirmed what I'd been trying not to think, what all the evidence had been pointing toward since the first appearance. She wasn't alive, at least not in any way I understood the term. She was something else, something caught between states, bound to the old telephone easement like a ghost haunting the scene of its death. "Why me?" I asked. "Why this house?" "Because you can see me," she said. "Because you've been measuring and documenting and trying to understand instead of just dismissing what doesn't fit your worldview. Because you're the first person to live along this line in 25 years who's actually capable of giving me what I need." "And what happens if I invite you in?" For the first time since I'd been seeing her, she smiled. Not the polite, practiced expression she'd worn during our previous encounters, but something genuine and hungry and absolutely terrifying. "Then I get to be alive again," she said, "and you get to find out what it's like to be me." The implication hit me like a physical blow, an exchange. My life for hers, my substance for her shadow, my warm blood for her cold hunger. The invitation she'd been fishing for wasn't just about crossing a property line. It was about crossing the boundary between death and life itself. "I can't do that," I said. "I know," she replied, and the hunger in her smile didn't diminish. "But you will. Maybe not tonight, maybe not next month, but eventually. I'm very patient, and you're very alone. Winter's coming, and the nights are getting longer, and sooner or later you're going to get tired of living like a prisoner in your own home." She was right, and we both knew it. I couldn't keep this up forever. The constant vigilance, the electromagnetic readings, the careful documentation of something that shouldn't exist. Eventually, I'd wear down, make a mistake, say the wrong thing at the wrong moment. All it would take was one unguarded invitation, one moment of politeness or exhaustion or simple human kindness. "What if I move?" I asked. "What if I just pack up and leave?" "The easement runs for miles," she said, "and there are others like me bound to other old lines, other forgotten boundaries. You can run if you want, but you'll just be trading one problem for another. At least with me, you know the rules." She was still standing at the property line, close enough to touch, if not for the invisible barrier that held her at bay. The electromagnetic detector in my hand was registering readings so high they'd pushed the needle completely off the scale, but I barely noticed anymore. I was too busy staring into those black eyes, trying to see some hint of the person she'd been before death had transformed her into something else entirely. "How long have you been here?" I asked. "Since 1967, she said. "Since the phone line went dead and I went with it." "You died here?" "I died trying to fix a connection problem. Climbed a pole during a storm, got electrocuted, fell right onto the easement line. Been stuck here ever since, waiting for someone who could see me, someone who could give me permission to step back into the world." The story filled in the last missing pieces of the puzzle: the telephone easement, the electromagnetic anomalies, the reports of strange encounters that had started just after the line was abandoned. It all connected through her, through this woman who died trying to restore communication and had been trapped ever since in a kind of technological purgatory. But understanding her origins didn't make the situation any less dangerous. If anything, it made her more frightening, because now I knew she'd once been human, once been someone with a life and hopes and probably people who'd mourned her passing. Death had transformed her into something else, something hungry and patient and willing to wait decades for the chance to steal someone else's life. "I should go inside," I said. "You should," she agreed. "But you'll come back. You always do. And one of these times, you'll be tired enough or lonely enough or just human enough to make a mistake." I backed toward my front door, keeping my eyes on her until I'd crossed the threshold and turned the locks. Through the window, I watched her standing at the property line until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Then, as the first rays of sunlight touched the hills, she faded away like smoke, but the electromagnetic detector continued to register her presence long after she disappeared from sight. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've reinforced every door and window in the house, installed motion sensors and security cameras, even considered having the old easement blessed by a priest. But I know it won't matter. She's right about the fundamental problem. I'm alone out here, isolated and increasingly paranoid, living like a prisoner in a house that's supposed to be my sanctuary. And she's patient. The appearances have become more frequent, sometimes daily, and the requests have grown more creative. She's asked to use my bathroom, to wait out imaginary rain showers, to come inside and warm up on nights when the temperature hasn't dropped below 60 degrees. Each request is phrased with the same careful politeness, the same implicit need for explicit permission. Last night she asked if she could help me bring in groceries from my car. I almost said yes. The word was balanced on my tongue, ready to fall into the space between us and grant her the invitation she'd been seeking for over 50 years. Only the sight of the electromagnetic detector's maxed out readings kept me silent, reminded me of what she was and what she wanted from me. But I'm getting tired. The constant vigilance is wearing me down, making me question not just what I'm seeing, but my own grip on reality. Maybe she's real, and I'm documenting a genuine supernatural encounter. Maybe she's a manifestation of my own isolation and growing psychological instability. Maybe the electromagnetic readings are just equipment malfunction, and the whole elaborate scenario is a delusion I've constructed to give meaning to my empty life in this remote house. It doesn't matter anymore. Real or imagined, she's winning. Each day, each appearance, each polite request chips away at my resistance a little more. Sooner or later, loneliness or exhaustion or simple human decency will overcome my caution, and I'll say the words she needs to hear. Yes, come in. Make yourself at home. And then I'll discover what it's like to spend eternity standing at the edge of someone else's property, wearing clothes the color of shadow, holding a phone that will never work, waiting with infinite patience for the next person to move into the right house at the wrong spot along an old boundary line. The electromagnetic detector is screaming again. She's back, standing at the property line in the pre-dawn darkness, and this time she's not holding a phone. This time, she's holding what looks like a rope. I found this caught on a tree branch, she's calling through the darkness. I think it might have blown off your porch during the storm. Could I bring it to your door? Story 3. The first time I noticed it, I convinced myself I was losing my mind. October had arrived with an unseasonable chill that cut through the valley like a blade, and I'd taken to running the electric heater in the barn during my late-night tinkering sessions. The old building sat 100 yards from the main house, its weathered wooden frame housing my workshop, tool collection, and the mezzanine where I stored lumber and seasonal equipment. What it also housed, I was about to discover, was something that shouldn't exist. I'd been organizing my drill bits when the tripod moved. Not fell, moved. A deliberate rolling motion that defied every law of physics I understood. The aluminum legs scraped against the concrete floor with a metallic whisper that raised the hair on my arms. I stood frozen, watching as the tripod settled on its side exactly 4 feet from where I'd left it, positioned as if someone had given it a careful nudge with their foot. The heater hummed in the corner, its orange coils painting dancing shadows on the walls. Above me, the metal roof ticked and settled as the temperature differential worked its expansion magic on the steel sheets. I told myself the vibration had shifted the tripod. Simple thermal dynamics. Nothing more. But I knew better. The thing is, I'm a methodical man. 30 years as a structural engineer taught me that every effect has a cause. Every mystery has a solution waiting to be uncovered through careful observation and logical analysis. So when my tools began their midnight migrations, wrenches sliding across workbenches, screwdrivers rolling off tables, metal rulers somehow finding their way to completely different locations, I approached the problem like any other puzzle requiring systematic investigation. I installed the security camera on a Tuesday, positioning it to capture the wooden staircase that led up to the mezzanine. The angle provided a clear view of both the stairs and my primary work area below. I set the motion detection sensitivity to maximum and waited. The first recording showed nothing unusual for exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Then the roof gave its familiar groan, that deep metallic protest of expanding steel, and everything changed. The sound registered on the audio track as a low rumble, almost subsonic. In the grainy night vision footage, I watched my level slide 3 inches across the workbench surface, moving with the smooth deliberation of an object being pushed by an invisible hand. But it wasn't the level that made my blood run cold. It was the stairs. In the bottom corner of the frame, I could see the first 4 steps of the wooden staircase. As the roof settled into silence, a shadow began ascending. Not the sharp-edged shadow of an object, but something diffuse and organic, flowing upward like smoke given weight and purpose. Step by step it climbed, pausing at each level as if testing its footing, before continuing its inexorable journey toward the mezzanine. I watched that footage 17 times before I convinced myself I wasn't hallucinating. The pattern emerged over the following weeks with scientific precision. Every thermal expansion of the roof triggered movement, both of my tools and of whatever inhabited the space above my head. The correlation was perfect, undeniable, and absolutely terrifying. I purchased an infrasound detector, a sensitive instrument capable of recording frequencies below human hearing. The data it collected confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Each roof expansion generated a specific low-frequency signature, a deep thrumming that seemed to resonate through the entire structure. But more importantly, the detector captured something else, a secondary pattern of infrasonic activity that occurred several seconds after each roof groan, as if something was responding to the initial sound. The recordings showed two distinct signatures. The first, broad and mechanical, clearly originated from the thermal expansion of metal. The second was narrower, more focused, and exhibited characteristics I couldn't easily categorize. It pulsed with an almost organic rhythm, rising and falling in waves that suggested intentional modulation rather than random acoustic phenomena. I began to dread the evening hours. Each night, as the temperature dropped and the heater clicked on, I found myself hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every subtle shift in the atmosphere around me. The barn had become a stage for some impossible performance, and I was both audience and unwilling participant. My sleep suffered. During the day, I caught myself listening for the telltale groans of expanding metal, even when the barn stood cold and silent. At work, colleagues commented on my distraction, my tendency to lose focus mid-conversation. I started avoiding the building entirely, letting projects accumulate dust while I sought refuge in the predictable sanity of my main house. But avoidance solved nothing. The mystery consumed my thoughts with the persistence of a fever, demanding resolution through scientific method and rational analysis. If something was manipulating the electromagnetic environment of my workshop, I would document it. If thermal expansion was triggering some kind of atmospheric disturbance, I would measure it. And if my sanity was finally succumbing to isolation and stress, I would face that truth as well. The copper cage took me 3 weeks to construct. I built it around the base of the staircase, using heavy-gauge wire woven into a mesh that would contain any electrostatic discharge or electromagnetic anomaly that might be causing the observed phenomena. The entire structure connected to a dedicated ground rod driven 8 feet into the earth outside the barn. Every joint was soldered, every connection tested for continuity. If my mysterious visitor required some form of electrical pathway to manifest its presence, I would deprive it of that necessity. The first night with the cage in place, I sat in my truck outside the barn, monitoring both the security camera feed and the infrasound detector on my laptop. The heater cycled on at 9:47 p.m., and the familiar sequence began. Roof expansion at 9:52, followed by the secondary infrasonic signature 30 seconds later, but nothing moved. My tools remained exactly where I'd left them. The shadow that had climbed my stairs with such regularity was absent from the camera feed. The copper cage sat silent and empty, its grounded mesh apparently containing whatever force had been manipulating my environment. I felt a mixture of vindication and disappointment. The mystery was solved. Electromagnetic phenomena, nothing more. Yet part of me had hoped for something more exotic, more challenging to my understanding of the world. The human mind, I reflected, has a perverse attraction to the inexplicable. But I was wrong about it being over. The change occurred on the 7th night of the cage experiment. I'd grown confident in my solution, even begun working in the barn again, secure in the knowledge that my mysterious visitor had been effectively neutralized. The copper mesh had restored order to my workshop, returned my tools to their proper places, eliminated the unsettling sense of invisible presence that had plagued me for months. I was threading a tap when the roof groaned its familiar complaint. Out of habit, I glanced toward the staircase, expecting to see nothing but the empty cage and the wooden steps beyond. Instead, I saw the shadow. It wasn't contained by the copper mesh. It wasn't climbing the stairs. It was descending. Step by step, with the same deliberate patience I'd observed in the camera footage, the shadow flowed downward from the mezzanine toward the main floor of the barn. Toward me. My rational mind insisted this was impossible. The cage was grounded, the electromagnetic pathways severed. Whatever had been causing the phenomena should have been neutralized, contained, eliminated from the equation. But here it was, bypassing my carefully constructed prison with apparent ease, moving with purpose that suggested intelligence rather than random atmospheric disturbance. I backed away from the workbench, my hand still gripping the tap, my eyes fixed on the approaching shadow. It reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, as if considering its options. In that moment of stillness, I realized my fundamental error. I'd assumed the cage would contain it. I'd never considered that it might simply find another route. The shadow began moving along the floor, flowing around obstacles with liquid grace. It approached the cage from the outside, testing the barriers I'd so carefully constructed. And as I watched in growing horror, it began to seep through the mesh itself, the copper wire offering no more resistance than if it were made of air. That's when I understood the true nature of my visitor. It didn't need electromagnetic pathways or electrostatic discharge to manifest. It didn't require thermal expansion or infrasonic resonance to exist. These were simply the conditions that called it forth, the circumstances that drew it from whatever realm it normally inhabited. The cage hadn't contained it. It had merely encouraged it to find a different approach. And now, it was exploring that approach with methodical precision. I watched the shadow complete its passage through the copper mesh and begin moving across the concrete floor toward my position. Each movement was deliberate, calculated, suggesting a level of intelligence that made my engineering background seem pitifully inadequate. This wasn't a phenomenon to be measured and contained. This was something that measured and contained others. The realization struck me like a physical blow. I wasn't the observer in this experiment. I was the subject. Every night I'd spent documenting its behavior. It had been documenting mine. Every pattern I'd identified, every correlation I'd discovered, had been carefully provided for my analysis. The shadow hadn't been randomly climbing stairs and moving objects. It had been training me, conditioning me to expect specific behaviors under specific circumstances. And tonight, by removing the ground from my carefully constructed cage, I'd given it exactly what it had been waiting for. The shadow reached my feet and began to climb. I felt nothing physical, no pressure, no temperature change, no tactile sensation whatsoever, but I experienced something else. Something that bypassed my senses entirely and spoke directly to the primitive parts of my brain that still remembered when darkness held genuine terror. A presence settled over me like a second skin, familiar and alien simultaneously. In that moment, I understood that I'd been asking the wrong questions entirely. Not what was happening in my barn, but what was happening to me. Not whether the phenomena were real, but whether I was still qualified to determine what constituted reality. The shadow had completed its ascent now, and I stood in the empty barn with my grounded copper cage and my useless measuring instruments, wondering if I was still alone, wondering if I'd ever been alone, wondering if the shadow climbing my stairs had always been my own, cast by a light I couldn't see, moving to rhythms I'd never learned to hear. Outside, the wind picked up, and the metal roof began its familiar song of expansion and contraction. But this time, I didn't wait to see what would answer. I walked to my truck on unsteady legs, started the engine, and drove back to the house, leaving the barn and its mysteries behind. In the rearview mirror, I could see the building silhouetted against the star-filled sky, its windows dark, its secrets intact. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. Something that no longer needed a barn, or stairs, or the convenient darkness of a workshop at night. Something that had found a more permanent residence, one that would never require grounding or electromagnetic containment, or any of the other pathetic human attempts to impose order on forces that predated understanding itself. Tonight, as I write this account, I can hear the house settling around me. The familiar groans and sighs of wood and metal responding to temperature changes, the ordinary sounds of a structure finding its equilibrium in the cooling night air. But I'm listening for something else now, something that might answer those sounds with movements of its own. Something that has learned to climb more than just stairs. And in the growing darkness of my bedroom, I'm beginning to suspect that it's still learning. Still climbing. Still here. Story 4. The doorbell chimed at 3:17 a.m., but no one was there. I knew this because the motion-activated camera had been sending alerts to my phone every few hours since I'd moved into the Providence duplex 3 weeks ago. Each time, the same recording. A figure approaching the front door, standing close enough to fog the lens with breath, then disappearing between frames. The timestamp never lied, but my eyes did. The figure looked exactly like me, down to the scar above my left eyebrow and the way I unconsciously touched my temple when thinking. The only difference was the eyes, where mine were hazel. His held a liquid darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The real estate agent had mentioned the previous tenant left suddenly, abandoning a security deposit and personal belongings. She'd laughed nervously when explaining how they'd found mirrors covering most of the interior walls, all perfectly positioned to create endless reflections throughout the narrow hallways. The mirrors stayed because removing them would damage the vintage wallpaper underneath, she'd said, as if that explained why someone would live surrounded by their own infinite image. I should have asked more questions. The duplex felt wrong from the moment I'd carried my first box across the threshold. The air moved differently here, thick and expectant, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Every footstep echoed longer than it should, and shadows lingered in corners even when bright afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows. The mirrors multiplied everything, not just my reflection, but the sense that something was always moving just outside my peripheral vision. It started with the hooded figure 3 days after I'd settled in. The first time I'd been walking from the kitchen to the living room, passing through the archway where an ornate mirror hung at eye level. In the reflection, I caught a glimpse of someone tall and angular, draped in dark fabric, moving parallel to my path, but in the opposite direction. When I spun around, the hallway behind me stretched empty, disturbed dust motes dancing in the late afternoon light filtering through gauze curtains. I convinced myself it was fatigue. The move had been stressful, my sleep fractured by the unfamiliar sounds of settling wood and distant traffic. But the figure appeared again the next morning, this time in the bathroom mirror as I brushed my teeth. Same height, same deliberate movements, but walking away from me while I stood frozen, toothpaste foam dripping from my slack jaw. The pattern became clear over the following week. The hooded figure manifested whenever I passed a mirror, but only when I wasn't directly looking at my reflection. If I focused on my own face, studying the tired lines around my eyes or the stubble I'd forgotten to shave, the background remained normal. But the moment my gaze drifted or I looked away entirely, he was there. A peripheral phantom sharing my space, but not my world. Meanwhile, the doorbell camera continued its nocturnal recordings. My doppelganger appeared with increasing frequency, always in the early morning hours when the street lay silent and empty. He would approach slowly, deliberately, until his face filled the entire frame. Those black eyes would stare directly into the lens for exactly 37 seconds. I'd timed it, before he would step backward and fade from view as if the darkness itself had swallowed him. I began to notice the correlation on a Thursday evening when my sister called. She'd wanted to know if I was settling in well, if I'd met any neighbors, if the neighborhood felt safe. Standard post-move check-in questions that demanded standard reassuring answers. But as I started to tell her everything was fine, that I loved the character of the old building and felt completely at home, my phone buzzed with a doorbell alert. Even as the lie formed on my lips, I watched myself approach the camera on the small screen, those alien eyes boring into the lens. I ended the call abruptly, claiming poor reception, and spent the rest of the evening pacing between rooms, testing the theory that was forming in my mind. Each time I considered calling her back with another comfortable deception, that I'd just been tired, that the move was going smoothly. The doorbell camera would activate, showing my dark-eyed twin taking his position at the front door. The hooded figure, I realized, had his own trigger. He appeared when I avoided my reflection, when I deliberately looked away from mirrors rather than confronting what I might see there. If I was honest with myself, I'd been avoiding mirrors for months before the move, uncomfortable with the stranger my face had become after the divorce, after losing the job, after too many nights when sleep came only with pharmaceutical assistance. The recognition that both figures responded to my deceptions, to others, and to myself, should have been reassuring. It suggested psychological rather than supernatural origins, the kind of manifestation that therapy and medication might address. Instead, it filled me with a creeping dread that settled into my bones like winter cold. Because if they were products of my fractured psyche, why did they feel so independent? Why did the camera capture my doppelganger when hallucinations should exist only in my perception? And why did the hooded figure move with such deliberate purpose, as if he had plans that extended beyond my immediate awareness? I began researching the previous tenant, the one who'd left so suddenly. Online records showed a Michael Hawthorne, a freelance graphic designer who'd lived alone and kept to himself. His social media accounts had gone silent 6 months before my arrival, the last posts showing increasingly erratic behavior. Photos of mirrors taken from odd angles, rambling captions about reflection and truth, images that seemed to contain too many faces for the number of people present. The public library's newspaper archives revealed more. Hawthorne had been reported missing by a concerned client when he'd failed to deliver a promised project. Police had entered the duplex after landlord complaints about strange noises and found it empty except for the mirrors and a journal filled with increasingly illegible handwriting. The final entry, partially legible in a photograph accompanying the article, mentioned something about bringing them together and the corridor solution. That's when I conceived the plan that now seemed both inevitable and insane. If the external double appeared when I was about to lie, and the internal figure emerged when I avoided self-reflection, then perhaps forcing them to occupy the same space might resolve whatever psychological or supernatural drama was playing out in my life. The narrow hallway between the living room and my home office seemed perfect, already lined with mirrors on both sides. It would be simple to add more, creating an infinite corridor of reflections. I spent 3 days acquiring additional mirrors from estate sales and antique shops, each purchase accompanied by the seller's warnings about the bad luck associated with broken glass and distorted reflections. The man at the vintage store on Federal Hill had been particularly insistent that mirrors retained the memories of everyone who'd ever looked into them, accumulating psychic residue like dust on old furniture. Installing them required precision. Each mirror had to align perfectly with its neighbors, creating an unbroken visual tunnel that would trap and multiply any figure caught within its boundaries. I worked methodically, measuring angles and adjusting positions until the hallway became a kaleidoscope of infinite regression, each reflection containing smaller versions of itself, stretching into apparent eternity. The effect was immediately disorienting. Walking through the corridor meant navigating countless versions of myself, each slightly offset, creating a strobe-like effect that made my steps unsteady and my vision blur. But it worked exactly as I'd hoped. When I stood at the living room threshold and looked down the hallway, I could see both figures simultaneously. The hooded shadow moved through the reflected space on my left, his dark form weaving between the mirror images. Meanwhile, my black-eyed double occupied the actual hallway, standing motionless at the far end near the office door. They existed in the same frame for the first time, separated only by the thin boundary between reality and reflection. For 3 days, I observed this standoff. Neither figure acknowledged the other, but their movements became more agitated, more purposeful. The hooded shadow began gesturing toward the mirrors as if trying to communicate, while my doppelganger started moving closer to the living room threshold, those liquid black eyes never leaving my face. I began to understand what Hawthorne had meant by the corridor solution. The mirrors weren't meant to contain the figures. They were meant to facilitate a meeting, a recognition, a convergence. Tonight, I'm ready to complete the experiment. I've positioned myself at the exact center of the corridor, equidistant from both ends, surrounded by infinite reflections of my own form. The hooded figure stands to my left in the mirror space, finally still. My dark-eyed twin approaches from the office end, moving with fluid grace that makes my own movements seem clumsy by comparison. As they draw closer, I begin to understand the true nature of what I've discovered. The hooded figure isn't a separate entity. He's me as I truly am, the version that exists when I'm not performing for others or lying to myself. The dark-eyed double isn't a supernatural visitor. He's the me that emerges when I'm about to deceive, the part of myself that I've tried to keep hidden, but that insists on being seen. They're not invaders. They're integrations. The mirrors around me begin to fog, as if touched by unseen breath. In the reflections, I watch the hooded figure lower his hood, revealing my own face but clearer somehow. more honest than I've allowed myself to appear in years. At the same time, my approaching double's eyes begin to lighten, the liquid darkness receding to reveal the hazel I recognize as my own. I understand now why Hawthorne left no forwarding address, why his journal entries became illegible toward the end. Some recognitions are too complete to survive unchanged. Some integrations require more than just acknowledgement. They require surrender. The two figures are close enough now that I can see they cast no shadows, create no additional reflections in the infinite mirror tunnel. They exist in the space between truth and deception, between self-knowledge and self-denial, waiting for me to choose which version of myself will walk out of this corridor. Or perhaps the choice has already been made. Perhaps it was made the moment I decided to build this trap, this meeting place, this convergence point where all versions of myself must finally face each other. The mirrors are fogging faster now, obscuring the reflections until only the three of us remain visible in the narrowing space between truth and illusion. I reach out my hands, one toward the honest shadow, one toward the deceptive twin, and feel their fingers close around mine. The last thing I see before the mirrors cloud completely is my own face looking back at me from the darkness, wearing an expression I don't recognize but somehow remember, as if I'm seeing myself clearly for the first time, or perhaps the last time. Tomorrow, someone will find the duplex empty except for the mirrors and another journal, this one containing my account of what happened in the corridor between truth and deception. They'll wonder where I went, why I left so suddenly, abandoning a security deposit and personal belongings. But I know the answer now, even as the thought begins to feel foreign, as if it belongs to someone else. Some integrations change you completely. Some recognitions require you to become something other than what you were. And sometimes, when you force all versions of yourself to finally meet, you discover that the person you thought you were was never really there at all. Story 5. The trail to Larrabee State Park had always been my sanctuary. Every weekend for 3 years, Baxter and I would make the 30-minute drive from Seattle to lose ourselves in the Douglas firs and western hemlocks that stretched toward the gray Washington sky. The familiar rhythm of my boots on the packed earth, the steady panting of my golden retriever, the whisper of wind through ancient branches. These sounds formed the soundtrack of my sanity, the weekly reset that kept me functional in a world that increasingly felt designed to grind me down. That October morning started no differently. The air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and fog rolled in from Bellingham Bay like a living thing, threading itself between the trees with deliberate purpose. I'd chosen the lesser-known trail that branched off from the main loop, a narrow path that few hikers bothered with because it led nowhere in particular, just deeper into the woods before eventually circling back. The solitude suited me perfectly. Baxter trotted ahead on his retractable leash, his golden coat dampened by the mist that seemed to rise from the forest floor itself. He paused occasionally to investigate some scent that only he could detect, his tail wagging with the simple joy that I envied. The silence felt complete, broken only by our footsteps and the distant drip of condensation falling from moss-heavy branches. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when the forest changed, not in any way I could immediately identify. The trees remained the same towering sentinels. The path continued its gentle curve through the undergrowth. But something fundamental shifted. The air grew heavier, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened. The fog, which had been drifting lazily through the trees, began to settle and pool in ways that defied the gentle breeze I could still feel on my face. Baxter stopped abruptly, his entire body going rigid. The hackles along his neck rose slowly, like grass standing up after being pressed flat. He didn't bark. Baxter was a barker by nature, announcing his displeasure at everything from squirrels to falling leaves, but now he only released a low, continuous whine that seemed to vibrate in the bones of my chest. That's when I saw him. The man stood perhaps 30 feet ahead, positioned precisely in the center of the trail where it narrowed between two massive cedar trees. At first glance, he appeared almost normal, a businessman who had somehow found himself in the wrong place entirely. His suit, once black or dark navy, was soaked through, the fabric clinging to his frame in a way that suggested he'd been standing in the rain for hours. But there had been no rain that morning, only the persistent mist that barely qualified as drizzle. His shoes were the first detail that truly registered as wrong. They were expensive-looking leather dress shoes, completely unsuitable for hiking, and they were caked with a thick red-brown mud that seemed too rich, too dark for the sandy soil of these particular trails. The mud didn't just cover his shoes. It seemed to creep up his legs, staining the bottom of his trouser legs in irregular patterns that reminded me of dried blood, though I knew it couldn't be. But it was his face that stopped my breath entirely. The skin was pale beyond any natural human pallor, almost translucent, with veins visible just beneath the surface like dark rivers on a winter landscape. And his eyes were entirely black. Not the brown, so dark. It appears black of some people, but a complete absence of color, as if someone had taken an ink brush to his sockets and painted over everything that should have been there. No iris, no pupil, no whites, just two perfect circles of obsidian that seemed to absorb, rather than reflect, the dim forest light. He spoke without moving his lips in any noticeable way, his voice carrying clearly through the moist air despite the distance between us. The words came with a cadence that felt rehearsed, as if he'd delivered this exact speech countless times before. "I need to touch your coat," he said. Not asked, stated, as if it were a simple fact of the universe that needed to be acknowledged. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to turn around, to grab Baxter and retreat the way we'd come. But something about the man's posture, the way he stood blocking the path with absolute stillness, suggested that turning my back on him would be a mistake of catastrophic proportions. I found myself taking an involuntary step backward, but my eyes remained fixed on his face, unable to look away from those terrible black voids. "No," I managed to say, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I don't think so." The moment I spoke, something extraordinary and horrifying happened. The man seemed to compress slightly, as if he were sinking into the soft earth beneath his feet. Not dramatically, just a subtle settling, maybe 2 or 3 inches, that made him appear shorter without actually moving. But when I glanced down instinctively to see if his feet had indeed sunk into the ground, he snapped back to his original height with such suddenness that I jerked backward, nearly tripping over Baxter's leash. "I need to touch your hair," the man continued, his voice maintaining the same eerily measured tone. Again, that sense of a script being followed, of words spoken 1,000 times in this exact sequence. "No," I repeated, more firmly this time, though my hands were beginning to shake. The forest around us seemed to have grown even quieter, as if every bird and small animal had fled from something they could sense, but I could only partially perceive. Again the man settled slightly into the earth, and again, when my gaze dropped to his feet, those impossibly mud-caked shoes that should have left prints but somehow didn't, he returned to full height with that same jarring suddenness. A pattern was emerging, and with it came a terrible understanding. The man became less substantial when I refused him, but only when I wasn't looking directly at him. More specifically, only when my gaze dropped below a certain point. I experimented cautiously, letting my eyes drift down to his chest level, then lower. Each time my vision moved below his collarbone, he seemed to deflate slightly, like a balloon losing air. But the moment I looked at his feet, at those horrible mud-stained shoes, he snapped back to full corporeal presence with renewed intensity. "I need to touch your hand," he said, right on schedule. This time I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I forced myself to study the mechanics of what was happening. When I kept my gaze fixed on his face, on those awful black eyes, he remained fully present and solid-looking. When I looked at his torso, he began to diminish. When I looked at the ground near his feet, he became most insubstantial. But the instant my eyes found his shoes themselves, he regained all his presence and more, seeming to grow slightly larger and more menacing. The rule was becoming clear. My attention gave him power, but not uniformly. The lower I looked, the more he faded, until I looked at his feet directly, at which point he not only returned, but seemed to feed off my observation. "No," I said for the 3rd time. and watched him sink another few inches into the forest floor. Baxter had stopped whining. In fact, he'd gone completely silent, pressed against my legs with a trembling that I could feel through the denim of my jeans. When I risked a quick glance down at him, I saw that his eyes were fixed not on the man, but on something beyond him. Deeper in the woods where the fog had grown so thick it was like looking into cotton. The man tilted his head slightly, the first movement he'd made since I'd first spotted him. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been confusion or disappointment. "I need to touch your coat," he repeated, starting the sequence over again. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. He was beginning the cycle again, as if my continued refusal had triggered some kind of reset, but there was something different this time, a subtle shift in his posture that suggested growing agitation. I realized with crystalline clarity that I needed to get past him. The trail behind me led back to the parking lot, to safety, to the world of coffee shops and weekend errands and mundane concerns that suddenly seemed precious beyond measure. But something told me that turning around would be exactly the wrong move, that the man, or whatever he was, expected me to retreat, perhaps even wanted me to. The path forward led deeper into the woods, but it also curved back toward the main trail eventually. If I could get past him, if I could navigate whatever test or trap this represented, I might find my way back to normalcy. The alternative was backing away from him slowly until either he followed me or something worse happened. "I'm going to walk past you now," I announced, surprised again by the steadiness in my voice. "I'm not going to touch you, and you're not going to touch me." The black eyes seemed to focus more intently on me, though it was hard to tell with the complete absence of visible pupils. He didn't respond verbally, but I sensed a shift in the air around him, a gathering of something I couldn't name but definitely didn't want to experience. I began to move forward slowly, keeping my gaze fixed firmly on his face. With each step, Baxter pressed closer to my legs, his body warm and reassuring against me. The man didn't move to block my path more completely, but he didn't step aside either. I was going to have to walk around him, through the narrow space between his position and the massive cedar to his left. As I drew closer, I could smell him. It wasn't the clean scent of rainwater I'd expected given his soaked appearance, but something earthier and more disturbing. The rich, loamy smell of freshly turned soil mixed with something organic and slightly sweet that I didn't want to identify. When I was perhaps 10 feet away, close enough to see the water still dripping from his hair and clothes despite the absence of any current precipitation, he spoke again. "I need to touch your hair." We were at stage 2 of his sequence, which meant he was responding to my proximity, rather than simply repeating his script. The realization made my stomach turn over. He was aware of me, tracking my movement, adapting his behavior to mine in real time. I kept walking, angling toward the space beside him. Baxter's leash had gone slack. He was staying so close to me that there was no tension in the line at all. When I was close enough to reach out and touch the man's wet sleeve, I made my mistake. Curiosity, that fundamental human flaw, overcame my caution for just an instant. I let my gaze drop from his face to his chest, then to his waist, then to his legs, and finally to those impossible shoes caked with mud that shouldn't exist. The moment my eyes found his feet, the man solidified with such sudden intensity that the air around him seemed to ripple. His hand shot out toward me with inhuman speed, fingers stretching for my jacket. I jerked backward instinctively, stumbling over Baxter and nearly falling. My gaze snapped back up to his face, and he immediately returned to his previous state, arm falling to his side as if nothing had happened. "I need to touch your hand," he said, moving to stage 3 right on schedule. My heart was hammering against my ribs hard enough to hurt. The brief contact, or near contact, had left me with the impression of fingers that were too long and too cold, though I couldn't be sure if he'd actually touched me, or if the sensation was just my mind filling in details that logic couldn't process. I had learned the crucial lesson. I could diminish him by looking down, but I must never, under any circumstances, look directly at his feet. That direct observation didn't just restore him, it supercharged him. gave him the ability to reach across space in ways that defied physics. Now came the real test. I needed to get past him while keeping my gaze elevated, but I also needed to see where I was stepping to avoid tripping over roots or rocks. The solution came to me with the clarity of desperation. I would look at the treetops. I would fix my gaze on the canopy high above and navigate by peripheral vision and instinct. "I'm walking past you now," I repeated, more to myself than to him. "I'm not going to look down." I tilted my head back and found a particular cluster of branches about 40 feet above the trail. The interweaving of Douglas fir and western hemlock created a natural pattern that I could use as a focal point. From my peripheral vision, I could see the man's general shape and position, could track his presence without directly observing him. The effect was immediate and encouraging. With my gaze fixed firmly on the forest canopy, the man began to diminish again, that subtle settling that suggested he was losing cohesion. I took a careful step forward, then another, using my peripheral vision to navigate around him, while keeping my eyes locked on the branches above. It was like walking through a dream. The world below my direct line of sight became fluid and uncertain. I could sense the man's presence, could feel him growing less substantial as I maintained my elevated gaze, but the lack of clear visual feedback made every step feel like walking on a tightrope over an abyss. Baxter stayed glued to my legs, his warm body serving as a guide and anchor. His breathing had become rapid and shallow, but he moved with me step by careful step, seeming to understand instinctively that silence and proximity were essential. When I was halfway past the man's position, he spoke again, but his voice was different now, fainter, more distant, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "I need to touch your coat." Back to stage one, but the words lacked the solid certainty they'd had before. I continued my slow progress, eyes fixed on the swaying branches above, peripheral vision tracking the increasingly insubstantial figure beside me. Step by step, I walked past him. The earthy, organic smell grew stronger for a moment, then began to fade. My peripheral vision suggested that he was still trying to speak, his mouth moving in that rehearsed pattern, but no sound was reaching me now. Finally, after what felt like hours but couldn't have been more than a few minutes, I was past him. I could sense empty trail ahead, could feel the absence of his disturbing presence. But I didn't dare look down yet, didn't dare risk seeing him in my direct vision and potentially giving him back his power. I continued walking with my gaze fixed on the canopy, counting my steps. 10 steps past him, 20, 30. At 50 steps, I finally allowed myself to lower my gaze slightly, though I kept it well above ground level. The trail ahead was empty. The fog had begun to lift, revealing familiar forest on all sides. Birds were singing again. When had they stopped? The normal sounds of the woods were returning, the natural symphony that had been absent during my encounter with the man. At 100 steps, I finally looked back. The trail behind me was empty too. No figure in a soaked suit, no impossible shoes caked with mud, no black holes where eyes should be. Just the gentle curve of the path through the trees, looking exactly as it always had. Baxter had relaxed against my legs, his tail beginning a tentative wag. When I looked down at him, his brown eyes were bright and alert, showing no sign of the terror that had gripped him minutes before. If not for the dampness of his fur where he'd pressed against me, and the slight tremor in my hands, I might have convinced myself that the entire encounter had been some kind of hallucination. But I knew what I'd seen, I knew what I'd experienced, the rules I'd discovered, the way direct observation gave him power, the way looking at his feet provided him with maximum solidity, the way fixing my gaze above chest level diminished him. These weren't the random details of a dream or mental break. They were too consistent, too specific, too functional. The walk back to the parking lot took 20 minutes, but it felt like emerging from underwater. With each step toward the trailhead, the world became more solid, more real, more comprehensibly normal. By the time I reached my car, I could almost convince myself that the encounter had been some kind of stress-induced episode, a manifestation of the anxiety and isolation that had been building in my life. Almost. But that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I found myself thinking about the man's shoes. Not just the mud that caked them, but the way they'd looked somehow familiar. The particular shade of brown leather, the style of the lacing, the worn pattern on the soles that I'd glimpsed during that crucial moment when I'd looked directly at his feet. I sat up abruptly, a cold certainty washing over me. I walked to my closet and pulled out the box where I kept my good shoes, the ones I wore to job interviews and funerals and other occasions that demanded formality. The brown leather dress shoes that I'd bought 3 years ago and barely worn. They were caked with the same red-brown mud, still damp despite having been in my closet for weeks. The mud I didn't remember walking through from places I'd never been. I stared at them for a long time, trying to construct some rational explanation. Maybe I'd worn them on some forgotten walk. Maybe the mud was from a construction site or a puddle that had looked cleaner than it was. There had to be an explanation that didn't require me to question the fundamental nature of reality. But deep down, I knew the truth was simpler and more terrifying. The man on the trail hadn't been wearing his shoes. He'd been wearing mine. And tomorrow, despite every rational instinct screaming at me to stay away, I would return to that trail. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. Because somewhere in the woods near Bellingham, a man in a soaked suit was waiting with my shoes on his feet, and I had the growing suspicion that he wouldn't be asking to touch my coat next time. He would be asking for something much more fundamental, something I might not be able to refuse forever, no matter how carefully I controlled where I looked. The next morning found me back on the trail before sunrise, Baxter reluctant but obedient at my side. This time, I came prepared. I'd practiced keeping my gaze fixed on distant points, had memorized the pattern of branches that had served as my navigation aid. I told myself I was returning to prove that the encounter had been a one-time anomaly, a stress-induced hallucination that wouldn't repeat. But as we approached the familiar curve where the trail narrowed between the cedar trees, I could already smell that rich, earthy scent that didn't belong in these particular woods. And in the distance, barely visible through the morning mist, I could see a figure waiting in a soaked suit. This time, when he spoke, his voice carried a note of recognition, almost of welcome. "I need to touch your face," he said, and I realized with growing horror that we had moved beyond his original script entirely. The rules were changing, and I was no longer sure that looking at the treetops would be enough to save me. Story 6. The high desert of New Mexico holds its secrets like a miser holds coins, tight-fisted and reluctant. I've been surveying these lands for 12 years, mapping everything from ranch boundaries to mineral rights, but I'd never worked near the old acequias until that October contract. The irrigation channels carved by Spanish settlers centuries ago still snake through the landscape like ancient scars, their earthen banks crumbling but persistent, carrying water and something else I couldn't name. The easement job seemed straightforward enough. Establish a water rights corridor along a 3-mile stretch where the acequia system intersected with a modern rancher's property line. Standard work, GPS coordinates, elevation measurements, boundary markers. The kind of job I could finish in 2 days with my eyes closed. The rancher, Martinez, had been cordial enough when he hired me, though he kept his distance during our initial walkthrough. He mentioned the area had been problematic for previous surveyors, but didn't elaborate. I assumed he meant difficult terrain or conflicting property records. I was wrong. I set up my base station on the first morning under a sky the color of old pewter. The autumn air carried the scent of sage and something metallic that might have been minerals leaching from the acequia's adobe walls. My drone hummed to life, its lidar system beginning the methodical process of scanning the terrain. The first few hours proceeded normally. I established my primary control points and began working eastward along the water channel. That's when I first saw him. He stood approximately 300 feet ahead of me, directly in the path I needed to survey. From that distance, his proportions seemed wrong somehow. Too tall, too narrow, like a reflection stretched in funhouse glass. His skin carried a sickly yellow pallor that reminded me of old newspaper, and what I initially mistook for long hair turned out to be something else entirely. Thin, dark strands that clung to his shoulders with unnatural adhesion, as if they were wet or coated in some viscous substance. I called out a greeting, my voice echoing strangely in the wide open space. He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that he'd heard me. Instead, he remained perfectly still, his posture suggesting careful observation. I had the unsettling impression that he was measuring something, perhaps the distance between us, perhaps something else entirely. When I took a step forward, lowering my equipment to move around him, he turned with fluid precision toward a cluster of four-wing saltbush and greasewood. He walked into the vegetation with impossible ease, his tall frame somehow navigating the dense thicket without disturbing a single branch. The plants didn't bend or rustle, they simply allowed his passage as if he were made of air rather than flesh. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes. The high-altitude sun can play tricks on vision, and I'd been staring at my tablet screen for hours. But when I looked again, the brush remained undisturbed, showing no evidence of his passage. No broken branches, no trampled earth, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The LiDAR data, when I reviewed it later, showed something far more disturbing than optical illusion. Where the tall figure had stood, my drone's laser measurements recorded what I can only describe as a geometric void, a space where the scanning system registered no return signal, as if the light had passed through empty air. The void was human-shaped, precise in its dimensions, and utterly impossible according to every principle of surveying technology I understood. I forced myself to continue working, rationalizing the incident as equipment malfunction combined with desert-induced hallucination. These things happen. The mind seeks patterns where none exist, especially in isolated environments. I established my next survey point and began the process of documenting coordinates. Point Alpha 7, I spoke aloud into my voice recorder, a habit developed over years of field work. The spoken reference helped me maintain organization and provided backup documentation for my digital records. The moment the words left my mouth, he appeared again. This time he stood at what my calculations indicated would be the next coordinate in my survey sequence, Alpha 8. The realization struck me with ice-cold certainty that this was no coincidence. Somehow, impossibly, my vocal identification of survey points was determining his location. I stared at him across the intervening distance, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped my equipment. He remained motionless, that same posture of careful observation, as if he were studying me with the same methodical attention I applied to mapping terrain. The sensation of being measured, evaluated, cataloged, pressed against my consciousness like a weight. Minutes passed. Desert wind whistled through the acequia's crumbling walls, carrying the dry whisper of tumbleweeds and the distant cry of a hawk. Neither of us moved. I found myself holding my breath, afraid that any sound might trigger some response from this impossible figure. When I finally forced myself to advance, he repeated the same fluid movement toward the brush. This time I watched more carefully, noting how his form seemed to blur slightly at the edges where he made contact with vegetation. The plants offered no resistance, no indication of solid matter passing through their space. He moved like smoke given shape, like shadow wearing the mask of substance. The LiDAR registered another void. I spent the remainder of that first day working in complete silence, communicating with my equipment through written notes and hand signals that would have looked absurd to any observer. Each time I successfully established a coordinate point without speaking, my survey progressed normally. The tall figure remained absent, but the moment I accidentally spoke, even a muttered curse when I dropped a pencil, he materialized at the next survey location with clockwork precision. By evening, my nerves were stretched thin as copper wire. I packed my equipment with deliberate care, trying to ignore the sensation of eyes watching from somewhere in the brush. The drive back to town felt like escape, though from what, I couldn't say. That night in my motel room, I researched the area's history with obsessive thoroughness. The acequia system dated back to the 1740s, built by Spanish colonists who'd learned irrigation techniques from local Pueblo tribes. Water rights in the region had been contested for centuries, with records showing numerous disputes, failed settlements, and abandoned claims. One particular entry caught my attention. A survey conducted in 1923 had been abandoned mid-project when the surveyor, a man named Thomas Brierly, was found 3 days later sitting beside his instruments, completely unresponsive. Local accounts described him as speaking in numbers and refusing to acknowledge human voices. He was institutionalized shortly afterward. I tried to dismiss the historical parallel as coincidence, but sleep came fitfully. Dreams filled with geometric voids and the sensation of being cataloged by something that existed in the spaces between coordinates. The second day began with forced determination. I would complete the survey through pure professional discipline. I developed a system of handwritten notes and silent gestures, treating my work like an elaborate pantomime. For several hours, the method proved effective. I established survey points at regular intervals, my equipment functioning normally, the tall figure nowhere to be seen. But silence is not natural to fieldwork. The habit of verbal notation runs deeper than conscious thought, embedded in muscle memory and routine procedure. When I discovered a significant elevation discrepancy that would affect the easement boundaries, I spoke without thinking. Deviation at point Charlie 12 requires... He was there before I finished the sentence. This time he stood closer, perhaps 50 feet away, and I could see him with terrible clarity. His skin wasn't simply yellow. It carried the waxy translucence of old parchment, stretched tight over bones that seemed too long for human anatomy. The dark strands clinging to his shoulders weren't hair at all, but something else entirely. Thin, root-like tendrils that pulsed with subtle movement, as if drawing sustenance from the air itself. His eyes, when he turned them on me, were the color of deep water seen from great depth, not blue or green or gray, but the absence of color that suggests infinite distance. They held no malice, no emotion I could recognize. They held calculation. I understood then, with a clarity that bypassed rational thought, that he wasn't simply appearing at my survey points. He was ahead of them, waiting at coordinates I hadn't yet established, mapping my progress with the same methodical precision I applied to mapping terrain. The realization carried implications that made my hands shake so violently I had to set down my equipment. He was surveying me. The rest of that day blurred into a nightmare of enforced silence. Every step forward required careful consideration, every movement calculated to avoid accidental speech. The tall figure followed my progress like a shadow cast by unfamiliar geometry, always positioned at the next coordinate in my sequence, always watching with those terrible measuring eyes. I began to notice other disturbances. My GPS readings fluctuated in his vicinity, showing impossible elevations and coordinates that placed me simultaneously in multiple locations. Radio communications crackled with interference that resolved into what sounded almost like numbers being recited in a language I didn't recognize. The Acequia's water, which should have flowed steadily westward, seemed to pause and pool in certain areas, creating mirror-smooth surfaces that reflected not the sky above, but something else entirely. By afternoon, I realized that maintaining complete silence was becoming impossible. Fieldwork generates necessary communication. Equipment malfunctions require troubleshooting. Measurements need verification. Safety protocols demand vocal check-ins with the outside world. The survey could not be completed without speaking. But every word I spoke brought him closer to my position, reduced the distance between us by increments that followed no pattern I could discern. Mathematical progression, perhaps, or some surveying principle beyond my understanding. When I called out point Echo 9, he appeared at Echo 10, standing near enough that I could see the way shadows fell around him incorrectly, pooling at his feet in shapes that suggested depths far greater than the shallow ground should permit. The lidar void had grown as well. What began as a human-shaped absence now extended several feet in all directions, as if reality itself was developing gaps in his presence. My equipment registered not just the absence of matter, but the absence of space. Measurements that implied negative distances, elevations below sea level in terrain that rose hundreds of feet above nearby valleys. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, I faced an impossible choice. I could abandon the survey, forfeit my contract, and leave the easement unmapped. Or I could continue working in the knowledge that each spoken coordinate brought this impossible figure closer to my position, narrowed the gap between surveyor and surveyed. Professional pride warred with growing terror. Martinez was depending on this survey to resolve his water rights dispute. The legal implications of an incomplete boundary mapping could affect land ownership for generations. But every instinct I possessed screamed warnings about what might happen when the tall figure finally closed the remaining distance between us. I made my decision as the desert light began to fade. I would finish the survey, but I would do it entirely in silence. No more spoken coordinates, no more verbal notes, no communication of any kind until the work was complete. It was possible, technically speaking, to document everything through written records and silent methodology. Difficult, time-consuming, but possible. The final dozen survey points took 4 hours to complete. I worked by the light of my equipment displays and a small LED headlamp, moving through the darkness with glacial care. Each measurement was triple-checked, every coordinate verified through redundant calculation. I spoke not a single word. The tall figure didn't appear again, but I could feel his presence like pressure against my skin, somewhere in the darkness beyond my light's reach. Watching, measuring, calculating distances I couldn't comprehend. When I finally packed my equipment and prepared to leave, the sensation of observation intensified. Every step toward my truck felt monitored, evaluated, recorded in some survey system that existed parallel to my own. The beam of my headlamp seemed to reveal nothing but empty desert, yet the weight of scrutiny never lifted. I reached my vehicle and loaded my gear with hands that had finally stopped trembling. The job was complete. The easement boundaries were mapped with precision sufficient for legal documentation. Martinez would have his water rights properly surveyed. As I drove away, my headlights swept across the Acequia's crumbling walls one final time. For just a moment, I thought I saw him standing beside the ancient water channel. Tall, impossibly thin, those dark tendrils moving against his shoulders like seeking fingers. But when I looked again, there was nothing but empty desert and the gleam of water flowing westward towards some distant destination. I submitted my survey data the following morning and collected payment from Martinez without mentioning the complications I'd encountered. Professional discretion seemed appropriate. The legal documents were filed, the easement properly recorded, the water rights dispute resolved. But sometimes late at night in my office, I review the LiDAR data from those 2 days. The geometric voids are still there in the digital files, human-shaped absences that my equipment recorded with mechanical precision, negative spaces where something that shouldn't exist left impressions in electromagnetic spectra. I've never taken another job near the old Acequias. When potential clients mention property in that area, I refer them to other surveyors. Professional courtesy, I tell them. But the truth is simpler and more disturbing. I know now that some territories are already mapped by surveyors who work with different instruments, measure different coordinates, record data for purposes I don't want to understand. They catalog the living with the same methodical precision we apply to terrain, establishing boundaries between what is and what might be, measuring distances that exist only when someone is there to observe them. The tall figure understood this principle long before I encountered him. He knew that observation creates reality, that measurement defines existence, that speaking coordinates into being gives them power over both surveyor and surveyed. I completed my final survey in silence, because silence was the only way to avoid becoming permanently cataloged in whatever system he represents. But I've never been certain whether my silence saved me, or whether it simply deferred a measurement that remains incomplete. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there beside the Acequia, waiting patiently at coordinates I never quite reached, ready to resume his survey the moment someone speaks the right numbers aloud. The thought keeps me awake some nights, listening to the desert wind and wondering what gets mapped when the surveyor becomes the surveyed. The boundary between observer and observed, I've learned, is far thinner than any property line I've ever drawn on paper, and some easements, once established, can never be abandoned. Story 7. The first thing I noticed wasn't the bags themselves, but the silence. Marcus and I had just returned from our weekly grocery run, arms loaded with paper sacks that crinkled like autumn leaves as we climbed the narrow stairs to our shared row house. The familiar rhythm of our footsteps on the worn hardwood should have echoed through the corridor, but instead, the sound seemed to die the moment it left our feet. swallowed by an oppressive quiet that made my skin prickle. I pushed open my bedroom door with my shoulder, expecting to dump the groceries on my unmade bed before sorting them in the kitchen. Instead, I found myself staring at two leather shoulder bags lying in the center of my floor like discarded thoughts. They weren't mine. They weren't Marcus's either. I could tell by the way his breathing changed behind me, a sharp intake that spoke of recognition and confusion intertwined. The bags were expensive looking, made of that buttery soft leather that develops character with age. But their handles had been severed with surgical precision, cut at identical points about 6 inches from where they attached to the body. The cuts were clean, deliberate, as if someone had measured twice before making their incisions. "What the hell?" Marcus whispered, setting down his groceries with the careful movements of someone trying not to disturb a crime scene. I crouched beside the bags, my fingers hovering over the severed straps. The leather edges were smooth, almost cauterized, suggesting a very sharp blade had done the work. But why cut the handles? Why not just take the bags entirely? My PlayStation 5 sat undisturbed on its shelf. My laptop remained open on the desk where I'd left it. Even the small bills scattered across my nightstand hadn't been touched. This wasn't theft. This was something else entirely. Marcus suggested we call the police, but what could we tell them? That someone had broken into our house to perform minor surgery on leather goods. I convinced him to wait until morning, to think it through. Maybe there was a rational explanation we were missing. That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the old house settling around me. Philadelphia row houses have their own language. Creaks that mean the wind is picking up, groans that signal temperature changes, whispers that are just the building breathing through its century-old lungs. But tonight, every sound seemed loaded with intention, as if the house itself was trying to tell me something I wasn't quite ready to hear. The ceiling fan in my room turned lazily, its gentle whoosh providing white noise that should have been comforting. Instead, it seemed to amplify every other sound, creating a symphony of paranoia that kept me suspended between sleep and wakefulness. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it, a soft rustling from the living room, like fabric being dragged across the floor. I held my breath, straining to identify the source, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. When I finally gathered the courage to investigate, I found nothing except the living room fan spinning on its lowest setting, the same way Marcus always left it. The next morning brought no answers, only more questions. While making my bed, I discovered a small piece of leather tucked beneath my comforter, a fragment of handle strap that matched the bags perfectly. My blood ran cold as I held it up to the light. I hadn't moved my bedding since the day before. I rarely did more than pull the comforter vaguely into place, leaving the sheets in their tangled morning configuration. Someone had been in my room while I slept. Someone had lifted my comforter, placed this leather fragment underneath, and carefully arranged everything back the way they'd found it. Marcus was already at work when I made this discovery, leaving me alone with the impossible arithmetic of the situation. I searched every inch of my room, looking for signs of entry, disturbance, anything that might explain how this had happened. The windows were locked from the inside, the door had been closed all night, and the hardwood floors showed no foreign footprints. Yet the evidence lay in my palm, warm from being trapped against my body heat all night. I spent the morning researching break-in methods, reading police reports, trying to find some precedent for this bizarre violation. What I found instead was information about the connected gardens behind our row of houses. The previous owner had mentioned them briefly during our walkthrough, a series of small backyards separated by tall wooden fences, creating a pathway that ran the length of the block. Theoretically, someone could navigate from garden to garden, but the fences were at least 8 feet high, and most residents kept their gates locked. Still, it was the only logical entry point, given that our front door had been secured with both a deadbolt and a chain lock. I spent the afternoon reinforcing our security, checking window latches, testing door frames, installing a small camera system that recorded to my laptop. If someone was using our house as their personal playground, I was going to catch them in the act. But as evening approached, I began to notice something else. Something that chilled me more than any broken lock or missing possession could have. The living room fan wasn't just running on low. It was creating a current. I'd never paid attention to the air circulation in our narrow house before, but now I found myself hypnotically drawn to the way the atmosphere moved through our shared spaces. The fan pulled air from the kitchen, drew it through the living room, and pushed it down the hallway toward our bedrooms. On the lowest setting, it created a gentle but persistent breeze that carried scents, sounds, and something else. Something I couldn't quite identify, but that raised the hair on my arms whenever I stood in its path. Marcus came home around 6, tired from his shift at the architecture firm, and found me standing in the hallway with a piece of tissue paper, watching the way it fluttered in the artificial wind. I tried to explain my theory, that the fan was somehow connected to our intrusions, that the current of air was more than just circulation, it was a pathway. Marcus listened with the patient expression he reserved for his more eccentric clients, nodding at appropriate intervals but clearly thinking I was losing my grip on reality. Maybe I was. That night, I experimented. I gathered supplies from our utility closet, a small box fan designed for bathroom exhaust, duct tape, and several rolls of painter's tape. If the living room fan was creating a tunnel that somehow facilitated our mysterious visitor, I was going to reverse the current and see what happened. I installed the exhaust fan in our back window, pointing outward, and began sealing the small gaps around our door frames and windows with tape. The goal was to create negative pressure in the house, to pull air through the space rather than pushing it. Marcus watched this process with growing concern, eventually asking if I thought I might benefit from talking to someone professional. His words stung because they echoed thoughts I'd been trying to suppress. Doubts about my own perceptions, fears that grief over my recent breakup had finally pushed me into a full psychological break. But I couldn't stop. The compulsion to understand what was happening in our house had become stronger than my desire to appear sane. With the modifications complete, I settled into my room to wait. The house felt different now. The air moved in new patterns, creating unfamiliar sounds and sensations. The gentle whoosh of the ceiling fan seemed louder, more insistent, as if it was fighting against the reversal of airflow. Around midnight, I heard movement in the kitchen. Not the settling sounds I'd grown accustomed to, but deliberate motion, cabinet doors opening and closing, something being dragged across the linoleum floor, the soft percussion of objects being rearranged. I grabbed my phone and activated the camera app, then crept toward the hallway. The sound stopped the moment I moved. I stood in the darkness, barely breathing, waiting for some sign that I hadn't imagined the activity. The modified air current brushed against my face, carrying a scent I couldn't identify, something organic but artificial, familiar yet completely foreign. When I finally found the courage to check the kitchen, everything appeared normal. But when I opened the refrigerator to grab a bottle of water, I found my grocery list from the previous day, the one I'd left on the counter, now carefully folded and placed between 2 bottles of beer. My handwriting stared back at me. Milk, bread, batteries, peace of mind. I didn't remember writing that last item. The next morning, Marcus found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the piece of paper. He'd been patient with my increasingly erratic behavior, but I could see the worry etched in the lines around his eyes, the way he moved more carefully around me, as if afraid I might shatter at any moment. I wanted to show him the list, to prove that something impossible was happening in our house. But when I tried to speak, the words tangled in my throat. How do you explain that you're being gaslighted by your own environment? How do you convince someone that the air itself has become malevolent? Instead, I asked him about the bags again. Had he recognized them? Did they belong to anyone we knew? Marcus paused in his coffee preparation, his back still turned to me. After a long moment, he admitted that the bags had looked familiar, but he couldn't place where he'd seen them before. Maybe a coworker's, maybe something he'd glimpsed in passing. His uncertainty felt deliberate, calculated, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I wondered if Marcus knew more than he was letting on. The thought hit me like a physical blow. What if the intrusions weren't coming from outside? What if the person violating our space, playing mind games with leather fragments and grocery lists, was someone who already had access to every room, every corner, every intimate detail of my daily routine? I studied Marcus's reflection in the kitchen window as he prepared his breakfast, looking for signs of deception, guilt, or malicious intent. But all I saw was my roommate of 8 months, the quiet architect who paid his rent on time and kept his dishes clean, looking increasingly concerned about my mental state. Which was the more terrifying possibility, that a stranger was manipulating my environment with supernatural precision, or that my trusted friend was orchestrating an elaborate psychological torture? The day passed in a haze of suspicion and self-doubt. I found myself analyzing every interaction, every casual comment, looking for hidden meanings and coded messages. When Marcus suggested I take a few days off work to rest, I heard threat beneath his concern. When he offered to cook dinner, I wondered what he might add to my food. By evening, I was exhausted from the constant vigilance, but I couldn't let my guard down. I'd made modifications to our air circulation system, but what if they weren't enough? What if the intrusions would continue regardless of fans and ductwork and sealed door frames? That night, I pretended to sleep while keeping one eye on my bedroom door. The exhaust fan hummed in the back window, fighting against the natural circulation patterns of the old house. The air moved differently now, but it still moved, carrying scents and whispers and possibilities I didn't want to contemplate. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the familiar rustling sound, but this time it seemed to be coming from inside my walls. Not mice or settling wood, but something larger, more deliberate, moving through spaces that shouldn't exist. I pressed my ear against the wall shared with Marcus's room and listened to the rhythm of his breathing. Steady, natural, undisturbed. Either he was an exceptional actor, or he was genuinely asleep. The rustling continued, seeming to move through the infrastructure of the house itself, following pathways that defied architectural logic. It traveled from the kitchen to the living room, up the stairs, along the hallway, and finally into my room, where it stopped directly behind my headboard. I lay perfectly still, every muscle tensed, waiting for the next movement, the next impossible sound. Minutes passed. The air from the reversed circulation system brushed against my face, carrying that same unidentifiable scent, organic, artificial, familiar, foreign. Then I felt it, the slightest disturbance of air pressure near my feet, as if something had passed through the space at the foot of my bed. The sensation lasted only a moment, but it was accompanied by the soft whisper of fabric against fabric. I wanted to turn on the lights, to confront whatever was sharing my space, but terror had locked my muscles in place. I could only lie there, breathing as quietly as possible, while something unseen moved through my room with the confidence of ownership. The activity stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving me alone with the sound of the exhaust fan and the rapid percussion of my own heartbeat. Morning brought no relief, only new evidence of overnight visitation. My laptop, which I'd left closed on the desk, was now open to a blank document. The cursor blinked steadily in the white space, as if waiting for me to type something, to contribute to a conversation I hadn't realized I was having. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to remember if I'd opened the computer myself, if stress and sleep deprivation had finally fractured my memory as well as my perception. But I could clearly recall shutting it down the night before, watching the screen go black, listening to the familiar whir of the cooling fan as it spun down to silence. Marcus had already left for work, leaving behind the scent of his cologne and the imprint of normalcy. I wanted desperately to call him, to confess my fears and suspicions, to ask for help in separating reality from delusion. But what if he was the architect of my torment? What if every word I spoke was being used to construct an even more elaborate maze of psychological manipulation? I decided to conduct one final experiment. That afternoon, I removed all of my modifications to the house's air circulation system. I took down the exhaust fan, peeled away the tape from the door frames and windows, restored the natural flow patterns that had existed before our uninvited guest began their nocturnal visits. If the intrusions were connected to the current of air moving through our space, then returning to the original configuration might bring some kind of resolution. Either the activity would resume, confirming my theory about supernatural manipulation, or it would stop, suggesting that my modifications had somehow been enabling the very thing I was trying to prevent. But as I worked, removing tape and repositioning fans, I began to wonder if the experiment would prove anything at all. What if the intrusions had never been real? What if the severed bag handles, the leather fragment, the moved grocery list, and the opened laptop were all products of my own deteriorating psyche? The human mind is capable of extraordinary self-deception, particularly under stress. Maybe I'd been sleepwalking, performing elaborate acts of vandalism and manipulation against myself, creating evidence of external threats to avoid confronting internal collapse. The thought terrified me more than any supernatural explanation could have. As evening approached, I found myself standing in the living room, watching the ceiling fan rotate on its lowest setting. The blades moved with hypnotic regularity, pushing air through the narrow space of our row house, creating the gentle current that had become the focus of my obsession. The air smelled different now, not the organic artificial scent I'd been detecting, but something else, something that reminded me of my childhood bedroom, of safety and comfort, and the certainty that monsters existed only in imagination. Marcus came home around 6:30, carrying takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant. He seemed relieved to find me in the living room instead of huddled in my bedroom, paranoid and exhausted. We ate together in companionable silence, the food warming my stomach and grounding me in the present moment. For the first time in days, I felt almost normal. But as night fell and we prepared for sleep, the familiar anxiety began to build in my chest. I'd reversed my modifications, restored the original air circulation patterns, set the stage for whatever had been visiting our house to return. Either I would finally get answers, or I would finally get proof of my own madness. I lay in bed with the lights off, listening to the gentle whoosh of the ceiling fan, the distant hum of the living room circulation, the creaks and groans of the old house settling around me. Everything sounded exactly as it had before this ordeal began, before leather bags with severed handles had appeared in my room like evidence of crimes I couldn't comprehend. The air moved against my face, carrying familiar scents and the promise of revelation. I waited. Around midnight I heard the rustling sound again, but this time I recognized it for what it was. The whisper of air moving through fabric, the soft percussion of my own breathing against the pillow, the ambient noise of a house that had never been haunted by anything more threatening than an overactive imagination. The leather fragment beneath my comforter had been placed there by my own hands during a sleepwalking episode I couldn't remember. The bags had been severed by my own unconscious actions, performed in a fugue state brought on by stress and isolation. The grocery list had been modified by my own pen, the laptop opened by my own fingers, all evidence of a mind trying to create external explanations for internal chaos. I should have felt relief at this realization, but instead I felt a deeper kind of terror, the fear that I could no longer trust my own perceptions, my own memories, my own capacity to distinguish between real and imaginary threats. The current of air continued to move through the house, carrying nothing more sinister than dust motes and the scent of ordinary life. But as I finally drifted toward sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, still waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. Maybe it was my own fractured psyche, reflected in the dark windows of our narrow row house. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of urban isolation and modern anxiety, given form by a mind desperate for concrete explanations. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something patient enough to wait until I'd convinced myself it didn't exist before making its next move. The fan continued to turn, pushing air through spaces that might or might not contain more than they appeared to hold, and I learned to sleep with one eye open, never quite certain whether the greatest danger came from outside my room or from within my own deteriorating grasp on reality. In the morning, I would find my laptop open again, displaying a single line of text I didn't remember typing. The current runs both ways, but that discovery still lay hours in the future, and for now I could only listen to the sound of air moving through darkness, carrying possibilities I wasn't ready to face. Story 8. The third apartment should have been different. That's what I told myself as I signed the lease in Portland, 3 states and 4 years removed from where this all began. But as I stood in the living room that first evening, watching the setting sun cast long shadows across the hardwood floor, I felt that familiar weight pressing against the base of my skull, the same sensation that had driven me from Boston, then Chicago, and now here. The moving boxes sat unopened in the center of the room, their cardboard edges softened by the humidity that seemed to seep through the walls of these old Pacific Northwest buildings. I'd learned to recognize the signs by now, the subtle temperature differential that ran in a vertical line along the far wall, the way sound seemed to deaden in that particular corner, and most telling of all, the architectural necessity that every landlord explained away with practiced indifference. Structural support, the property manager had said, tapping her pen against the lease agreement. Buildings from 1924, they had to reinforce it when they converted from industrial to residential. I'd nodded and smiled. The same performance I'd given in Chicago when they'd mentioned the old coal chute, and in Boston when they'd explained the sealed-off dumbwaiter shaft. Always a column, always exactly 7 feet 1 inch tall, a foot taller than any door in the building, as if deliberately designed to tower over human proportions. The unpacking could wait. I found myself drawn to that corner, my fingertips tracing the raised texture of paint that had been applied too thick, layer upon layer, as if previous tenants had tried to bury something beneath. The wall felt cold, even in the late August heat, and when I pressed my ear against it, I could swear I heard something that might have been breathing, slow, rhythmic, patient. By the second week, I'd established what I thought was a routine. Graduate work in linguistics kept me busy during the day, and I'd convinced myself that staying occupied would be enough this time. But routines, I was learning, meant nothing to whatever occupied the space behind that wall. It had its own schedule, its own rhythms that seemed to sync with something deeper than circadian cycles. The first manifestation came on a Tuesday night. I'd been working late, cross-referencing phonetic variations in regional dialects, when peripheral vision caught the familiar wrongness that I'd hoped to leave behind in Chicago. The darkness in the corner wasn't empty anymore. It had weight, presence, a density that seemed to absorb light rather than simply existing in its absence. I kept my eyes fixed on my laptop screen, fingers continuing to type even as every instinct screamed at me to run. The thing, and I'd stopped pretending it was anything else, didn't move in any conventional sense. It simply was, and then it was more, growing upward like smoke filling an invisible container. 7 feet, 1 inch. Always the same height, always that exact measurement that placed it just above the realm of normal human experience. My laptop's camera sat positioned perfectly to capture the corner, part of the security system I'd installed after Chicago. But when I finally worked up the courage to check the footage the next morning, the recording showed only that familiar fisheye distortion in the upper right corner, as if the lens itself was being stretched by some gravitational anomaly. The ceiling appeared to curve downward, bowing like the surface of disturbed water, while the corner remained stubbornly, impossibly empty. Dr. Martinez entered my life the way most desperate solutions do, through a late-night internet search that led me down a rabbit hole of paranormal investigation forums. She preferred the term building sensitivity specialist, which sounded clinical enough to let me maintain some semblance of academic credibility. When she arrived at my apartment that Thursday afternoon, I was surprised by her mundane appearance. A middle-aged woman in sensible shoes carrying what looked like a standard contractor's toolkit. The previous tenant left these apartments after only 3 months, she said, running some kind of electromagnetic sensor along the problematic wall. And before that, the tenant lasted 6 weeks. Property manager didn't volunteer that information, I'm guessing. She didn't wait for confirmation, instead pressing what looked like a modified stethoscope against various points along the wall's surface. Her expression remained neutral, professional, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes when she reached the corner. Industrial buildings from this era often had extensive chimney systems, she explained, packing away her equipment. Steam heat, coal furnaces, even small-scale manufacturing operations. When they convert these spaces, they seal everything off rather than properly venting it. Creates what you might call atmospheric pressure pockets. The way she said atmospheric pressure pockets suggested she was choosing her words carefully, translating something more complex into language I might accept. The column behind this wall, she continued, used to be a chimney flue. It's been sealed at both ends for nearly 30 years. But these old systems, they develop what I call thermal memory, air currents that persist long after their original purpose has been eliminated. I asked her what she recommended, though part of me already knew the answer would be the same solution I'd been avoiding for 4 years. Install a small ventilation grate, nothing elaborate, just enough to allow airflow. Sometimes these pockets just need a way to breathe. After she left, I sat in my living room staring at the corner where the darkness gathered each night. Breathe. Such a simple organic word for something that felt anything but natural. And yet, as night approached and the temperature began its familiar drop, I found myself wondering if Dr. Martinez had chosen that word deliberately. The air pressure sensor I'd ordered online arrived within days, along with a small digital display that would track minute changes in atmospheric conditions. I mounted it on the wall adjacent to the corner, watching as it registered the ambient pressure of my apartment's climate-controlled environment. For the first few nights, it remained steady until 2:43 a.m. I'd been monitoring the readings from my bedroom, laptop open beside me, refreshing the sensor's data log every few minutes. At exactly 2:43, the pressure dropped. Not dramatically, but consistently. A subtle decrease that lasted for exactly 11 minutes before gradually returning to baseline. It happened every night, always at the same time, with mechanical precision that made my skin crawl. But it was the accompanying sensation that truly unnerved me. As the pressure dropped, something else seemed to fill the space, a presence that I could feel even from the bedroom. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming almost syrupy, heavy with an expectancy that made breathing feel laborious. And in that corner, in that exact spot where the sealed chimney ran behind the wall, something waited. I began staying awake during those 11-minute intervals, laptop balanced on my chest, watching the sensor readings while trying to ignore the way the darkness in the corners seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. The fisheye distortion on my security camera became more pronounced during these periods, the ceiling's apparent curvature so severe that it looked as if reality itself was being drawn downward into some invisible drain. The solution seemed obvious, and that's what terrified me most. Dr. Martinez had been clear. Install a ventilation grate, allow airflow, give the system a way to breathe. It was practical, scientific, perfectly reasonable, except for the growing certainty that whatever was behind that wall wasn't interested in atmospheric pressure or thermal memory. It was waiting for exactly what I was considering giving it: an opening. The hardware store clerk assured me that the installation would be straightforward. A small rectangular grate, maybe 6 inches by 4, positioned at the base of the wall where the corner met the floor. Standard drywall saw, basic mounting hardware, nothing more complicated than hanging a picture frame. I carried the supplies home with the distinct feeling that I was purchasing my own trap. That evening, I found myself kneeling beside the corner with the drywall saw in my hand, measuring and remeasuring the dimensions for the grate. The wall felt colder than usual under my palm, and when I pressed my ear against it, the breathing sound was unmistakable, slow, patient, rhythmic. Something was definitely behind there, something that had been sealed away for 30 years and had learned to wait. The saw's blade bit into the drywall with a sound like tearing fabric. As the first few inches of material fell away, I felt a subtle change in air pressure, not the drop I'd been monitoring, but an equalization, as if two separate atmospheres were suddenly finding balance. The breathing sound stopped. I cut faster, driven by a momentum that felt both inevitable and terrifying. The rectangular opening took shape with surgical precision, revealing the dark space beyond. As the final piece of drywall came free, I felt it, a gentle but unmistakable current of air flowing out of the opening, carrying with it a scent that was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but ancient, settled, patient. The pressure sensor's alarm chirped once, registering a sudden spike in atmospheric readings. Through the opening, I could see nothing but darkness, but that darkness had texture now, movement, as if something vast was shifting position just beyond the reach of light. I installed the grate with trembling fingers, securing it over the opening I'd created. The metal felt ice cold against my hands, and as I tightened the final screw, I heard what might have been a sigh, a sound of deep satisfaction, of something that had been holding its breath for 3 decades, finally allowed to exhale. That night, the pressure readings remained steady. No more 2:43 a.m. anomalies. No more 11-minute windows of atmospheric disturbance. The corner remained visibly empty, and my security camera recorded nothing more exotic than the usual play of shadows from passing streetlights. By any measurable standard, the problem had been solved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake. The change was subtle at first, a barely perceptible shift in the apartment's acoustic properties, the way sound seemed to carry differently from room to room. My footsteps echoed with a hollow quality that hadn't been there before, as if the space itself had somehow expanded beyond its physical dimensions. And the temperature, not colder exactly, but more dynamic, shifting in ways that couldn't be explained by the building's HVAC system. Most disturbing was the sense of occupation. The apartment no longer felt empty when I was alone. Something was moving through the space I'd opened, exploring, familiarizing itself with territory that had been denied to it for so long. I never saw it directly, but I felt its presence constantly, a awareness that tracked my movements from room to room, patient and curious and utterly alien to human experience. The grate itself showed signs of regular use. Each morning, I found it slightly warm to the touch, and the metal had begun to develop a patina that looked decades old despite being newly installed. Sometimes, late at night, I heard sounds coming through it, not breathing, but something more complex. Rustling, perhaps, or the whisper of movement through spaces that should have remained sealed. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom, instead setting up a makeshift bed in the kitchen, where I could keep the corner under constant observation. But observation meant nothing when dealing with something that existed primarily in peripheral vision, in the spaces between one heartbeat and the next. It was there, and I'd given it exactly what it wanted, a way in, or perhaps, more accurately, a way through. The realization came to me during my 3rd sleepless night in the kitchen, staring at the innocuous metal grate that had become the focal point of my existence. I'd been thinking of it as an opening, a breach in the wall that separated my living space from whatever lurked behind it. But what if I had it backward? What if the column, the sealed chimney, wasn't a prison, but a passage? The building's history suddenly took on new significance. Industrial to residential conversion, they'd said. But what kind of industry required chimney systems that reached 7 feet, 1 inch in height? And why did every apartment I'd lived in have the same configuration, the same measurements, the same carefully sealed vertical spaces that ran from foundation to roof? I thought about the previous tenants, the ones who'd lasted only weeks or months before fleeing. Had they installed their own grates? Had they each given this thing exactly what it needed to expand its territory, to explore new spaces, to move more freely through a network of passages that spanned not just buildings, but states? The sounds coming through the grate were more frequent now, more confident. Sometimes I heard what might have been footsteps, impossibly elongated footsteps that seemed to cover distances greater than the physical dimensions of the column should allow. And occasionally, in the deepest part of the night, I heard voices, not words exactly, but patterns of sound that suggested communication, coordination, purpose. I'd given it a way to breathe, just as Dr. Martinez had recommended. But breathing wasn't a solitary activity. Breathing connected things, created networks, allowed isolated pockets to become part of larger systems. And something that had been patient enough to wait 30 years for an opening would certainly be patient enough to use that opening wisely. The measuring tape confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. 7 feet, 1 inch, the exact height of the column behind my wall, matched the distance between the floor of my apartment and the ceiling of the unit below. In a building with 10-foot ceilings that left nearly 3 feet unaccounted for, space that existed in architectural blueprints, but not in any tenant's actual living area, I pictured it moving through those hidden spaces, flowing like liquid darkness through passages that connected not just rooms, but entire buildings, entire city blocks. A network of sealed chimneys and forgotten infrastructure, all of it leading somewhere. All of it serving some purpose that humans had conveniently forgotten when they'd converted these industrial spaces into homes. The grate had been installed for 6 days when I finally understood why the previous tenants had left so quickly. It wasn't the presence itself that became unbearable. It was the growing certainty that the presence was no longer confined to your apartment. It was everywhere now, connected, part of something vast and patient and utterly inhuman that had learned to use human infrastructure for its own purposes. And I'd given it exactly what it needed. Not just an opening, but permission, an invitation, a way to expand its territory one apartment at a time, one desperate tenant at a time, each of us convinced that we were solving our own individual problem, rather than contributing to something much larger. The moving boxes remained unopened in the center of my living room, but now they seemed less like possessions waiting to be unpacked and more like luggage for a journey I was finally ready to take. Because there was really only one solution left. The same solution I'd used in Boston and Chicago. The same solution the previous tenants had discovered. I could run again. Find a new apartment, a new city, a new state. Start over somewhere else and hope that this time would be different. That this time I'd find a building where the walls held nothing but empty space, and the corners remained precisely as angular as geometry intended. But as I stood there in my kitchen at 2:43 a.m., listening to the sounds of something vast and patient moving through passages I'd helped to open, I wondered if running was even possible anymore. Because if I was right about the network, about the connected system of hidden spaces that spanned buildings and cities and states, then there might not be anywhere left to run to. The thing behind the wall had been waiting for 30 years. And now, thanks to one small grate installed by one desperate tenant, it didn't have to wait anymore. It could breathe, it could move, it could grow, and it knew exactly where to find me, no matter how far I ran. Story 9. The Vermont cabin had seemed like salvation when I'd booked it 3 months ago. After the promotion that never came and Sarah's sudden departure, I needed isolation, complete, therapeutic silence, broken only by wind through pines and the distant crack of settling timber. What I found instead was a different kind of break entirely. The first night passed without incident. I'd arrived just as dusk painted the snow-covered valley in shades of purple and gray, the kind of postcard beauty that makes city dwellers forget why they love concrete and crowds. The cabin sat on a gentle rise, surrounded by white birch and towering evergreens, their branches heavy with snow that hadn't melted despite the unusually warm January thaw. My suite occupied the entire second floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering an unobstructed view of the forest that stretched toward the Canadian border. I'd fallen asleep to the whisper of wind against glass, the kind of profound quiet that makes your ears ring with phantom sounds. But sometime around midnight on the second night, I woke to something else entirely. The moon hung full and brilliant, casting silver light across the pristine snow. Every tree trunk stood out in sharp relief, every shadow etched with crystalline clarity. It was beautiful in that almost painful way winter nights can be, when the cold seems to purify everything it touches. I lay there for several minutes, simply watching the interplay of light and darkness through the massive windows. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just another shadow among shadows, perhaps a low branch swaying in the breeze. But as my eyes adjusted, the shape became impossible to dismiss. Something enormous filled the lower portion of my window, a dark mass that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the moonlight. But it was the silhouette that made my breath catch, two wide branching shapes extending from what could only be described as a head. Horns, massive spreading horns like those of some primordial elk, but larger than any creature I knew existed in these mountains. I remained perfectly still, afraid that the slightest movement might alert whatever stood just beyond the glass. The thing, I could think of no other word for it, remained motionless as well, as if we were engaged in some primitive staring contest. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force I was certain the sound would carry through the window. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. No sound of retreat, no rustling of brush or crunch of snow, simply there one moment, absent the next. I forced myself to wait another 20 minutes before approaching the window, though every instinct screamed at me to hide under the covers like a frightened child. When I finally gathered the courage to press my face against the cold glass and peer down, the moonlight revealed exactly what I'd somehow known I would find. A line of deep impressions in the snow, each one easily the size of dinner plates, leading directly to the spot beneath my window. The tracks stopped there, not turned away, not scattered by a sudden retreat. They simply ended, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished into the night air. I called the front desk on the internal phone, my voice shakier than I'd intended. The night manager, a sleepy-sounding local named Pete, assured me that deer were common in the area, and that the moonlight could play tricks on perception. Large bucks, he explained, could cast impressive shadows, especially when seen from above. The deep tracks were likely the result of the animal's hooves breaking through the crusty top layer of snow. His explanation was reasonable, logical, and completely inadequate. I'd grown up in rural Minnesota. I knew what deer looked like, how they moved, what tracks they left. What I'd seen possessed a mass and presence that no whitetail could match. I spent the rest of the night seated in the armchair facing the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the forest. The shadows played their usual games, shifting and dancing with each cloud that passed across the moon, but nothing else appeared. As dawn approached and the strange magic of moonlight faded, I began to feel foolish. Perhaps Pete had been right. Perhaps the stress of recent months had primed me to see monsters where none existed. But when I went outside that morning to examine the tracks more closely, any comfort I'd found in rational explanations evaporated. The impressions were indeed deep, deeper than made sense for any animal, as if whatever had made them possessed impossible weight. More disturbing still, they showed no clear definition of hooves or paws. Instead, each track appeared as a simple, oval depression, smooth-sided and eerily symmetrical. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake off the previous night's unease. The Vermont wilderness in winter holds a particular beauty, stark, clean, almost austere in its simplicity. The trails were well maintained, marked with bright orange blazes that stood out cheerfully against the white bark of birch trees. I encountered other hikers, a friendly couple from Boston, who recommended a local restaurant, and their normalcy helped restore my equilibrium. But as I made my way back to the cabin in the late afternoon, I found my thoughts returning to the window, to the shadow that had filled it so completely. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more frequently, pausing to listen for sounds that never came, scanning the tree line for movements that existed only in my imagination. That evening, I attempted to focus on the novel I'd brought, a thriller that now seemed tame compared to my own experience. But as the hours passed and midnight approached, I found myself watching the window more than the pages. When I finally gave up the pretense of reading and simply stared into the darkness, I wasn't entirely surprised by what happened next. The shadow returned. This time, I was ready for it, or thought I was. I'd positioned myself to observe while remaining hidden behind the partially drawn curtain, and I forced myself to study the shape with clinical detachment. The creature, for I could no longer pretend it was anything else, stood motionless beneath my window for nearly an hour. The horns were definitely real, spreading wide in a magnificent crown that would have been beautiful if it weren't so terrifying in context. Occasionally, I thought I could make out the suggestion of eyes, twin points of reflected moonlight that might have been watching me as intently as I watched it. When it finally departed, it did so with the same impossible silence as before. One moment it filled my view, the next, only empty snow remained. But this time, I was prepared. I'd already slipped on my boots and jacket, and I made my way downstairs as quietly as possible. The cold hit me like a physical blow as I stepped outside, the kind of bitter chill that makes your lungs ache with each breath. I'd brought a powerful LED flashlight, and its beam cut through the darkness with harsh efficiency. The tracks were there, of course, that same line of deep, smooth depressions leading directly to my window and stopping abruptly. But as I followed the beam around the perimeter of the cabin, checking the other sides, I discovered something that made no sense at all. There were no other tracks. None. The snow around the rest of the building remained pristine, unmarked by any passage. It was as if the creature had materialized directly beneath my window, stood there for an hour, then simply ceased to exist. I stood in the freezing night air, playing my light over the impossible scene, trying to construct some rational explanation. The snow was soft enough to take clear impressions. I could see my own footprints trailing behind me. Whatever had made those tracks possessed significant mass and had definitely been present. Yet it had apparently approached and departed without leaving any trace of its passage, except for those final steps. The next morning brought revelation of sorts, though not the kind that offered comfort. I'd been keeping a journal throughout my stay, jotting down observations about the local wildlife, the changing weather, my attempts to decompress from months of urban stress. As I reviewed my entries, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. For the past week, my dreams had been remarkably consistent. Each night I dreamed of footsteps in snow, always approaching from the same direction, always following the same path, always ending at my window. I'd written these dreams off as products of my subconscious processing the unfamiliar sounds of the forest, the crack of branches, the whisper of wind, the settling of the old cabin. But now, reading my own words, I realized the dreams had been rehearsals. Every detail of the previous 2 nights had played out first in my sleeping mind. The moonlight on snow, the massive shadow, even the precise placement of the tracks. It was as if some part of me had known what was coming, had been preparing for this encounter for days. The thought that followed was even more disturbing. If my dreams had been prophetic about the creature's visits, what did that say about the other recurring dream I'd been having? The one where I stood outside in the bitter cold, staring up at my own window, seeing a pale face pressed against the glass. My own face, watching me with eyes that held no recognition whatsoever. I decided to take more concrete action. That afternoon, I drove to the nearest town and purchased supplies, a bag of all-purpose flour, a motion-activated trail camera, and, though I felt foolish buying it, a thermal imaging device meant for wildlife observation. If something was visiting my window each night, I was going to document it properly. The flour I spread in a wide circle around the entire cabin, creating a barrier that nothing could cross without leaving evidence. The trail camera I mounted on a tree 20 feet from my window, aimed to capture whatever approached from the forest. The thermal imager I positioned on my nightstand, ready to detect any heat signature that might appear. As I worked, I became increasingly aware of the silence surrounding the cabin. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I'd initially found so therapeutic. This was something else entirely, a heavy stillness that seemed to press against my eardrums. No birds called from the trees, no small animals rustled through the underbrush. Even the wind had died away, leaving the forest wrapped in an unnatural hush. That night, I positioned myself in the chair facing the window, the thermal imager in my lap, its screen glowing softly in the darkened room. Midnight came and passed without incident. Then 1 o'clock, then 2. I began to think that perhaps my preparations had somehow disrupted whatever pattern had been established, that the very act of seeking evidence had driven away the thing I sought to document. I was wrong. At 2:47 a.m., the thermal imager's screen exploded with color. A massive heat signature approached from the forest, far larger and more intense than any animal I'd seen in the device's manual. The shape was roughly humanoid, but wrong, in ways that made my eyes water to follow. It moved with a strange, gliding motion that left no thermal footprints in its wake, as if it floated just above the snow's surface. When it reached the perimeter of flour I'd laid down, something impossible happened. The thermal signature simply stopped, hanging in the air several feet from the ground. Then, without transition, it appeared directly beneath my window, exactly where it had stood the previous nights. I forced myself to look up from the screen and out through the glass. The shadow was there, as massive and impossible as before, but now I could see something new in its silhouette. It wasn't just standing beneath my window. It was looking up, directly at me. The thermal imager showed nothing but empty air where I sat. According to its sensors, I didn't exist. I remained frozen in my chair for what felt like hours, though the digital clock claimed only minutes had passed. The creature below never moved, never shifted its gaze. We watched each other through the glass and the screen, predator and prey in roles I no longer understood. When it finally departed, it did so with the same impossible dissolution as before. One moment the thermal signature filled my screen, the next, empty forest. No gradual retreat, no cooling trail of passage, simply there, then not. But this time, when I went outside to check my flower barrier, I found something that challenged every assumption I'd made about my mysterious visitor. The flower remained undisturbed, forming a perfect white circle around the cabin. Yet beneath my window, the familiar tracks waited in the snow, deeper than ever, as if the creature had pressed down with increasing weight. More disturbing still, the trail camera had been moved. Not damaged, not knocked over, simply repositioned to face the cabin instead of the forest. When I checked its memory card, I found hours of footage showing my own window, my own face occasionally visible behind the glass. But there was something wrong with those images, something that made my stomach clench with recognition and dread. In every frame where I appeared, my face wore an expression I didn't remember making, a look of intense, predatory focus, as if I were studying something beyond the camera's range with the same unwavering attention that something had been studying me. Standing in the pre-dawn cold, staring at my own alien expression on the camera's tiny screen, I finally understood the rule that had been governing these encounters. When I looked from inside out, I saw the creature in its tracks, evidence of its impossible visits. But when I looked from outside in, through camera lenses, thermal sensors, all the objective tools I'd brought to bear, I saw only myself, watching the forest with eyes that seemed to belong to something else entirely. The cold that had been seeping through the cabin's walls wasn't the Vermont winter finding its way past insulation and wood. It was something else entirely, something that breathed with the rhythm of my own lungs and watched the world through the windows of my own eyes. I packed my bags that morning and drove back to the city, leaving 2 days early. But the distance doesn't seem to matter. Each night I dream of standing in snow, looking up at windows filled with my own face. And sometimes, when I wake in my apartment, I find flowers scattered across my floor in patterns I don't remember making, and footprints leading to my bedroom window. Footprints that match the ones I found in Vermont, except now they end at my own bed. The thing that stood beneath my window in the forest didn't follow me home. It was already here, had always been here, waiting behind my own eyes for the right moment to show me what I'd become. The creature with the spreading horns and impossible presence wasn't something from the Vermont wilderness at all. It was my reflection, cast in moonlight and shadow in all the empty spaces where I'd forgotten how to be human. Story 10. The cottage smelled of salt and decades-old wood polish when I first stepped inside, keys still warm from the realtor's palm. 3 days in Cape Cod, that's all I'd booked, just enough time to decompress from the city's relentless pulse. The place was quaint in that deliberately rustic way that vacation rentals achieve, complete with nautical-themed throw pillows and a lobster-shaped bottle opener mounted beside the kitchen sink. My college roommate Jake had tagged along, claiming he needed the break as much as I did, though I suspected he just wanted to split the cost. The cottage sat on a quiet stretch of beach road, far enough from the main strip to avoid the summer crowds that would descend in a few weeks. Our bedroom housed 2 twin beds separated by a nightstand that looked like it had survived several decades of renters. Jake claimed the bed closer to the window immediately, leaving me with the one facing the door, a detail that seemed insignificant at the time. That first night passed without incident. We'd spent the evening walking the beach, then returned to crack open a few beers while Jake regaled me with stories from his recent dating disasters. I fell asleep to the sound of waves through the thin walls and his steady snoring, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. The second night changed everything. I woke at 3:30 a.m. with the jarring certainty that someone was watching me. The room was darker than it should have been. Clouds must have covered whatever moon had been visible earlier. I lay on my side, facing the door, when my eyes adjusted enough to make out a silhouette. A woman stood less than 3 feet from my bed. She was impossibly still, her form a void against the already dark room. Long hair framed what I couldn't quite see as a face, falling past her shoulders in waves that seemed to absorb rather than reflect what little light filtered through the curtains. I couldn't make out features, couldn't determine age or expression, but something about her posture suggested she was leaning forward, studying me. Then she spoke. Psst. The sound was barely audible, more breath than voice, heavy and deliberate like smoke escaping a barely open door. It carried an intimacy that made my skin crawl, as if she'd been trying to get my attention for hours. Every muscle in my body seized. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even convince my lungs to draw a full breath. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress or the unfamiliar environment. But the texture of the sheets against my clenched fists felt real. The salt air through the window felt real. Jake's snoring from the other bed, steady, oblivious, felt devastatingly real. I don't know how long we remained frozen in that tableau, her dark form hovering while I lay paralyzed with terror. Eventually, exhaustion must have won, because I woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains and Jake already moving around, getting ready for our planned morning hike. I said nothing about the night visitor. How could I? Jake would have laughed it off as a stress-induced nightmare, and part of me desperately wanted to believe that's all it had been. But throughout the day, as we explored tide pools and ate overpriced lobster rolls in town, I found myself scanning crowds for long, dark hair, for that particular stillness I'd witnessed. That evening, I made excuses about being tired and suggested we turn in early. Jake shrugged and agreed, more interested in the baseball game he'd found on the cottage's ancient television. I lay in bed listening to his breathing slow and deepen, dreading what 3:30 might bring. It brought her again. This time I sensed her presence before I opened my eyes, that prickly awareness that someone is occupying your space without permission. When I finally looked, she was in the same position as before, standing beside my bed, leaning forward, impossibly still. The psst came again, that smoky whisper that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my chest. This time, I noticed details that somehow made it worse. Her silhouette wasn't completely solid. I could make out the faint outline of the doorframe through her torso. And her breathing, I couldn't hear it, but I could feel it. Cool air moving across my face in steady rhythms that didn't match my own panicked gasps. Again, I lay frozen until consciousness slipped away sometime before dawn. The next day brought a manic need to take control of the situation. While Jake spent the afternoon on the beach, I flipped every mirror in the cottage to face the walls. I told myself it was about eliminating reflective surfaces that might create illusions, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that mirrors provided too many places for something to hide. That night, I went to bed wearing headphones, hoping music might block out whatever supernatural frequency she operated on. I chose a playlist of familiar songs, something to anchor me to reality if my mind started playing tricks again. 3:30 a.m. arrived with mechanical precision. Even through the headphones, even with music filling my ears, I heard them. Soft footsteps crossing the small rug beside my bed. The sound was muffled, as if whoever was walking wore thick socks or bare feet, but it carried weight, deliberate placement. The steps moved from somewhere near the door to the foot of my bed, then around to where she'd stood the previous nights. I kept my eyes closed, focusing on the music, but I could feel her there. The temperature around my bed had dropped several degrees, and that strange not breathing sensation returned, cool air moving across my skin in patterns that didn't match the room's ventilation. The music in my headphones began to distort. What had been clear vocals and crisp instrumentation became warped, slowing to an unnatural pitch as if the battery was dying. But my phone showed full power. Through the degrading audio, I heard something else. A sound like fabric rustling, like someone adjusting their position to get a better look. When I finally opened my eyes, she was closer than before, her dark silhouette leaning over my bed at an angle that should have been impossible to maintain without falling. The whisper came again, but this time it seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if several someones were trying to get my attention. I ripped the headphones off, and the cottage fell silent, except for Jake's continued snoring. The silhouette was gone, but the coldness lingered, and I swear I could smell something, not unpleasant, but unfamiliar, like old books and winter air. By the fourth day, I'd developed a theory that felt both comforting and terrifying. She only appeared when I was lying on my side, facing the door. There was a pattern, a rule to follow. In my growing desperation to understand what was happening, I'd latched onto this one concrete detail like a lifeline. Tonight would be different. Tonight, I would break the ritual. I positioned myself deliberately, lying flat on my back with my feet toward the door, staring up at the cottage's exposed ceiling beams. My phone lay on my chest, video recording, camera pointed toward the area where she'd appeared before. If this was real, if something was actually manifesting in that corner of the room, I'd have proof. If the whisper came from a different direction, if it followed my changed position, then I'd know my mind wasn't creating some elaborate hallucination based on sleep position and shadows. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. 3:25, 3:28, 3:29. At exactly 3:30, the cottage's silence deepened, as if someone had thrown a blanket over the world. Jake's snoring stopped mid-breath. The distant sound of waves faded. Even the old building's natural settling noises ceased, leaving a vacuum of sound that made my ears ring. The footsteps began. They were different this time, more tentative, confused. Instead of the direct path from door to bedside, they wandered, circling the room as if searching for something. They paused at the foot of my bed, and I felt that familiar temperature drop. But it moved too, following the footsteps as they continued around to my left side, then my right, then back toward the door. My phone grew cold against my chest, the screen dimming despite being fully charged. Through the failing display, I could see the camera was still recording, but the image was becoming increasingly distorted, filled with static and dark shapes that might have been shadows or might have been something else entirely. Then the whisper came, not from beside my bed where she'd always stood before, but from directly above me. Psst. The sound was different too, no longer smoky and distant but clear and intimate, as if someone was lying on the ceiling looking down at me. I felt cool breath on my face, smelled that same combination of old books and winter air, but stronger now, almost overwhelming. My phone screen went completely black. In the darkness, I heard fabric rustling, the sound of someone or something adjusting their position to get comfortable. The breathing, that strange not breathing that I felt rather than heard, settled into a rhythm directly above my face, as if she had found her preferred vantage point and was settling in to watch. I don't know how long I lay there, staring up into darkness that seemed to stare back. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under despite my terror, and I woke to morning light and Jake's usual routine. My phone was dead, completely drained despite having been fully charged when I started recording. When I finally got it powered up again, the video file was corrupted, just static and distorted audio that might have been wind or might have been whispering. Jake noticed my haggard appearance over breakfast and suggested we cut the trip short, head back to the city a day early. I agreed immediately, desperate to escape whatever was happening in that cottage bedroom. But as we packed our bags, I found myself glancing back at the room, at the spot where she'd stood those first nights. Part of me wondered what would happen if I stayed longer, if I continued changing the rules of our nightly encounters. Would she adapt again? Would she find new ways to make her presence known? The thought both terrified and fascinated me. We left Cape Cod that afternoon, driving back toward civilization and electric lights and sounds that couldn't be confused for footsteps. Jake spent the ride talking about potential weekend plans, oblivious to my preoccupation with rearview mirrors and the nagging feeling that something was following us at a distance. I never told him about the whispers, the footsteps, the cold presence that had visited me each night. How could I explain that I'd encountered something in that cottage? something that had learned my habits, adapted to my attempts at control, and ultimately followed me even when I broke its rules. Back in my apartment, I sleep with all the lights on and music playing, but sometimes in that space between waking and sleeping, I feel cool air moving across my face in patterns that don't match my ceiling fan. And sometimes, just as I'm drifting off, I hear it, faint but unmistakable. Psst. The cottage is still available for rent. I checked the website obsessively for weeks, expecting to find reviews from other guests who'd had similar experiences. But there's nothing. Just glowing testimonials about the peaceful atmosphere and restful nights. Maybe I'm the only one she visits. Maybe there's something about me that drew her attention. Some frequency I operate on that resonates with whatever she is. Or maybe she's still there, waiting in that room, learning new patterns from each guest who lies in that bed facing the door. I've considered going back, testing my theories about rules and patterns and the nature of whatever haunts that place. But I know that way lies madness, or something worse. Some questions are better left unanswered, some rules better left unbroken. Still, on nights when sleep won't come and the city feels too loud and bright, I find myself wondering, if I return to Cape Cod, if I lay in that bed one more time, what new rule would she create? What pattern would emerge from our strange, silent communication? The thought should terrify me. It doesn't. And that, perhaps, is the most frightening thing of all. Story 11. The electric pencil sharpener upstairs ground away at something for 17 minutes that Tuesday morning. I know because I timed it, watching the seconds tick by on my laptop screen while trying to focus on quarterly reports that seemed to blur together like watercolors in rain. The mechanical whirring had started at 9:43 a.m., right when I should have been deep into the Morrison account analysis I'd been postponing for 3 days. Working from home had its perks, but the old Victorian house my grandmother left me came with its own soundtrack of settling wood and mysterious sounds. Still, 17 minutes of constant sharpening felt excessive, even for a house that liked to remind me of its age through creaking floorboards and pipes that sang lullabies at midnight. When the grinding finally stopped, the silence felt heavier than the noise had been. I saved my work, what little progress I'd managed, and climbed the narrow staircase, each step announcing my approach with a groan that seemed to echo longer than it should have. The second-floor hallway stretched before me, longer than I remembered it being that morning, lined with doors I rarely opened anymore. The closet door stood ajar. I never used that closet. Hell, I'd forgotten it existed most days, hidden as it was behind a corner where the hallway bent toward what used to be my grandmother's sewing room. The brass knob, tarnished with age, caught the pale morning light filtering through the window at the hall's end. Inside, 2 pencils lay on the dusty wooden floor, their yellow bodies pristine against the darkness, their tips sharpened to perfect points that seemed to catch and hold what little light reached them. I hadn't bought those pencils. I was certain of that. My office downstairs was stocked with mechanical pencils, pens, and a laptop that handled everything I needed for work. These were old-fashioned number 2 pencils, the kind kids used in school, the kind my grandmother probably kept around for crossword puzzles and grocery lists. The police officer who responded to my call was polite, but clearly thought I was wasting his time. Officer Martinez walked through the house with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen enough real problems to recognize manufactured ones. He checked the windows, all locked. The doors, secure. The basement, empty, except for my grandmother's old furniture draped in sheets like sleeping ghosts. Sometimes items get displaced during cleaning or moving things around, he suggested, though his eyes held the particular patience reserved for citizens who called about pencils appearing in closets. Maybe you forgot about putting them there, but I knew I hadn't. The certainty sat in my chest like a cold stone, heavy and immovable. 3 days later, I found another pencil in my car's center console. This one was different, hexagonal instead of round, with that old-fashioned wood and metal ferrule design that reminded me of pencils from decades past. The tip was sharpened to a needlepoint, so perfect it looked machine-made. I'd driven to the grocery store that morning without checking the console. I was sure of it. But there it lay, nestled between loose change and gas receipts like it had always belonged there. That's when I started paying attention to the pattern. The Morrison account that I'd been avoiding for days. The morning after I found the closet pencils, I'd somehow managed to complete it without remembering sitting down to work on it. The files were organized, the analysis thorough, the conclusions drawn with a precision that felt foreign to my usual scattered approach. When I checked the document's metadata, it showed I'd worked on it for 3 hours the previous evening, though I had no memory of those hours. The hexagonal pencil appeared the day I was supposed to call my insurance company about a rate increase notice I'd been ignoring for 2 weeks. When I got home from the grocery store, I found the call had been made. The representative's number was written in my handwriting in the margin of the notice, along with a confirmation number and the note. Rate locked for 12 months. My handwriting, but not my memory. I started keeping a detailed log of every pencil appearance, every completed task I couldn't remember finishing. The pattern became undeniable. Whenever my schedule slipped, whenever I procrastinated or delayed something important, a pencil would appear in an impossible location. Under my coffee mug when I was certain I'd left the counter clear. Tucked into the spine of a book I hadn't touched in months. Once, impossibly, inside my laptop bag which I'd zipped shut and left untouched for hours. And always, the task would be completed by the next day. The sensation of being watched grew stronger with each incident. It started as a barely perceptible itch between my shoulder blades when I sat at my desk, a feeling like someone standing just outside my peripheral vision. Then it became more pronounced, the certainty that eyes were following my movements as I moved through the house, the sense that I was performing for an audience I couldn't see. Late at night, I'd hear soft sounds from other parts of the house, footsteps that might have been settling wood, papers rustling that could have been wind through a crack I hadn't found, the electric pencil sharpener running for exactly the amount of time needed to sharpen one pencil to perfection. I started speaking to empty rooms, asking questions that hung in the air like smoke. Who are you? What do you want? But the house only answered with its usual symphony of age and settling, leaving me to wonder if I was losing my mind, or if something had decided to become my personal efficiency expert. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed listening to every sound, cataloging each creak and whisper, trying to separate the ordinary noises of an old house from something more deliberate. Sometimes I'd drift off only to wake with the certainty that someone had been in my room, standing at the foot of my bed, watching me sleep. But there were never any signs, no footprints in the dust, no disturbed items, nothing but the lingering sense of presence that clung to me like morning fog. That's when I decided to test my invisible editor. I bought red graphite pencils from an art supply store downtown, the kind used for sketching and corrections. If something or someone was monitoring my productivity, editing my life to keep me on track, I wanted to see how it would respond to my own attempt at control. I started writing my avoided tasks in red, marking them with a color that screamed urgency and importance. The first red entry was simple. Call dentist for overdue cleaning appointment. I wrote it in bold red strokes and left the notebook open on my desk, then went to bed early, curious about what morning might bring. I woke to find the entry crossed out in black pencil, the appointment scheduled, and a new yellow pencil, perfectly sharpened, sitting on top of the notebook. But this time was different. This time, I remembered making the call, remembered the receptionist's voice and the way she'd clicked her tongue when she saw how long it had been since my last visit. The memory felt real, felt like mine, but it was layered with a strange doubling sensation, as if I was remembering someone else's experience of being me. The red graphite seemed to trigger something more intrusive. Instead of waking up to completed tasks with no memory of doing them, I began experiencing flashes during the day, moments where I'd find myself doing things with a clarity of purpose that felt foreign to my usual scattered approach to life. I'd be in the middle of reading a book or watching television, and suddenly I'd be at my desk, fingers moving across the keyboard with mechanical precision, completing work that had been marked in red the night before. During these episodes, I felt like a passenger in my own body, aware but not in control, watching my hands move and my thoughts organize themselves with an efficiency that was both impressive and terrifying. The work was always perfect, always exactly what needed to be done, but it felt like wearing clothes tailored for someone else's body. The sensation of being watched intensified. I started catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that seemed too purposeful to be tricks of light, shapes that disappeared the moment I turned to look directly at them. My reflection in windows and mirrors began to feel unstable, as if someone else might be looking back at me with my own eyes. I installed security cameras around the house, thinking I might catch evidence of an intruder, some rational explanation for the perfectly placed pencils and mysteriously completed tasks. But the footage showed only me, going about my daily routines with occasional periods of standing perfectly still, staring at nothing, while my body remained motionless for minutes at a time. During these frozen moments, the timestamp on the cameras would continue normally, but I had no memory of the time passing. The red graphite experiment escalated when I started writing more personal tasks, more emotional ones. Call mom and apologize for missing her birthday. Clean out grandmother's room and decide what to keep. Figure out why I feel so lonely all the time. These appeared crossed out too, but the memories that accompanied their completion were different, deeper, more invasive. When I remembered calling my mother, I could recall not just the conversation but the emotions behind it, the guilt and love and frustration that I'd been avoiding feeling. The memory felt like mine, but it was cleaner somehow, more resolved than my emotions usually were. Cleaning out my grandmother's room was the most disturbing. I found myself upstairs one evening with no memory of going there, standing in the doorway of her bedroom, which I'd avoided since moving into the house. The room was partially organized, her clothes folded neatly on the bed, her jewelry box open with pieces arranged by type and value. I was holding one of her fountain pens, and my hand was moving across a piece of her stationery, writing in handwriting that looked like mine but felt different under my fingers. The letter was addressed to me, in my grandmother's voice, explaining which items I should keep and which I should donate. It contained memories I'd never heard, stories about my grandfather and my father as a child, details about the house and its history that I couldn't have known. The handwriting was mine, but the knowledge wasn't, and the love in the words felt like someone else's love channeled through my pen. That night I woke up to find all the pencils I'd collected arranged on my nightstand in a perfect line, points facing the same direction, organized by length from shortest to tallest. 16 pencils, all different, all sharpened to identical points. In the morning, there were 17. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom. I started camping out on the living room couch, leaving lights on throughout the house, but the activity continued. Pencils appeared in pockets I hadn't worn, in books I hadn't opened, in the refrigerator between the milk and the orange juice. My productivity soared to levels I'd never achieved, but I felt less and less like myself with each completed task. The breaking point came when I found a pencil inside my coffee mug one morning, standing upright in the bottom of the cup like a tiny lighthouse. The impossibility of it, how had it gotten there? When had it gotten there? Finally forced me to confront what I'd been avoiding acknowledging. Either I was losing my mind, experiencing some kind of elaborate psychological break that was manifesting as hyperproductivity and false memories, or something else was sharing my life, something that cared more about my efficiency than my autonomy, something that was slowly editing me into a better version of myself without my consent. I stopped using red graphite. I stopped writing down tasks at all. I tried to live in a state of deliberate chaos, leaving things undone, embracing procrastination as a form of rebellion against whatever was trying to optimize my existence. But the pencils kept appearing, and the tasks kept getting completed, and I kept having memories of doing things I'd never decided to do. The house felt different now, charged with a presence that was no longer trying to hide itself. Footsteps in other rooms became bold and regular. The pencil sharpener ran at the same time every morning, 9:43 a.m., for exactly as long as it took to sharpen however many pencils had appeared overnight. Doors that I left closed stood open, and doors that I left open were found closed, as if the house itself was breathing, expanding and contracting around some invisible rhythm. I started talking to it directly, carrying on one-sided conversations with whatever was listening. What do you want from me? Why are you doing this? Who are you? The questions echoed through the empty rooms, but the answers came in the form of more pencils, more completed tasks, more memories that felt like mine, but belonged to someone else. Sometimes, in the moments between sleep and waking, I thought I could sense its motivation. It felt parental, almost protective, like something that loved me enough to make me better whether I wanted to be better or not. It reminded me of my grandmother, who used to reorganize my school projects when I wasn't looking, who would quietly complete chores I'd forgotten about, who cared for me with efficiency that sometimes felt overwhelming in its thoroughness. But this was different. This was inside my head, inside my hands, inside my memories. This was rewriting me from the inside out, and I couldn't tell anymore where I ended and it began. Now I write everything in pen. I use my laptop for all my work. I've hidden every pencil I can find, thrown them away, burned them in the fireplace. But they keep appearing, and I keep completing tasks I never meant to start. And I keep having memories of a life that feels like mine but doesn't belong to me. The truth is, I'm more productive than I've ever been. My work is better, my relationships are healthier, my life is more organized and purposeful than it was before the pencils started appearing. By any objective measure, whatever is editing my life is doing a good job. But I can feel myself disappearing, one completed task at a time, one false memory at a time, one perfectly sharpened pencil at a time. And the worst part is, I'm not sure I want it to stop. The person I'm becoming is better than the person I was. The life I'm living is more successful, more fulfilling, more complete. Maybe that's what terror really is. Not the fear of something bad happening, but the fear of something good happening in a way that makes you cease to exist. The fear of being loved so completely that there's nothing left of you to love. The pencil sharpener is running upstairs right now. It's 9:43 a.m., and I have reports to finish, calls to make, a life to live. In a few minutes, I'll climb those stairs and find however many pencils are waiting for me today, and I'll probably use them to write down the tasks I'm avoiding, and tomorrow I'll have memories of completing them that feel real enough to be mine. The question I can't answer, the question that keeps me awake on the living room couch, surrounded by lights that can't chase away the feeling of being watched, is whether I'm being saved or slowly erased, whether this is healing or haunting, whether the thing that loves me enough to make me better is setting me free or writing me out of my own story, one perfect point at a time. Story 12. The highway cuts through Oregon's Douglas fir forests like a black river, and I've been swimming upstream against its current for 3 months now. Every night, same routine. Clock out at midnight from the lumber mill in Cottage Grove. Drive the 120 miles home to Salem through corridors of towering evergreens that seem to lean inward, as if the forest itself is trying to reclaim the asphalt scar we've carved through its heart. I never minded the drive until that first night in October, when the temperature dropped below freezing and something crossed my path at exactly 3 in the morning. The highway between Cottage Grove and Salem follows old Native American trails, winding through valleys that loggers have been working for over a century. Most of the original growth is gone, replaced by uniform rows of planted Douglas firs that create an unnaturally geometric landscape in daylight. But at night, with my headlights cutting through the darkness, those ordered rows become a maze of shadows that seem to shift and breathe just beyond the reach of illumination. Mile marker 117 sits at the bottom of what used to be Timber Ridge, a modest hill that the highway department leveled back in the 1970s to reduce the grade. Now it's just a gentle depression between 2 forested slopes, 4 lanes wide with a grass median splitting the opposing traffic. The asphalt here is newer than the surrounding road, darker, and when it rains it reflects my headlights like black glass. I was coming through that section, radio tuned to late-night talk shows to keep me company, when something moved in my peripheral vision. At first I thought it was a deer. We get plenty of them crossing at night, and I'd already slowed down instinctively. But deer don't move like arrows. They don't flow across 4 lanes of highway in a single fluid motion that seems to defy physics. The thing I saw was pale gray, about the size of a large dog, but stretched low and horizontal. It moved on 4 limbs, but not like any animal I'd ever seen. There was something liquid about its locomotion, as if it was made of mercury given form. It appeared from the forest on my right, crossed all 4 lanes, including the median, in perhaps 2 seconds, and vanished into the trees on my left. The entire encounter lasted maybe 3 seconds, long enough for my foot to lift off the accelerator, long enough for that primal chill to race up my spine, long enough for my rational mind to start making excuses before I'd even processed what I'd witnessed. Just a deer. Trick of the headlights. Late-night fatigue playing games with perception. But I couldn't shake the memory of how wrong it had looked. How the proportions seemed all off, too long in some places, too narrow in others. How it had moved with such purpose, such inhuman grace. I told myself it was nothing and drove the rest of the way home, but my hands were shaking when I pulled into my driveway. The next night, I found myself unconsciously slowing down as I approached mile marker 117. My eyes scanned the tree line, searching for movement, but the forest remained still. I passed through without incident and felt foolish for my apprehension. The third night, it happened again. Same time. My dashboard clock read exactly 3 a.m. as I crested the small rise before the leveled section. Same location, between markers 117 and 118. Same impossible motion as something gray and low streaked across the highway just ahead of my front bumper. This time I was watching for it, and I saw it more clearly. 4 limbs, definitely, but they moved in a rhythm that didn't match any animal's gait. And the way it held its body, arched, almost like a cat stretching, but horizontal and moving at tremendous speed. I slammed on the brakes, my truck skidding slightly on the cold asphalt, and sat there with my hazards blinking while my heart hammered against my ribs. The forest around me was completely silent. No crickets, no wind in the trees, no rustling of small animals. Just the ticking of my cooling engine and the electronic pulse of my emergency flashers. I sat there for 10 minutes, staring into the darkness, but nothing moved. Finally, I turned off the hazards and continued home, but I couldn't concentrate on the radio anymore. The silence from those woods had felt wrong, expectant, as if the forest was holding its breath. By the 4th night, I was carrying a flashlight. By the 5th, I'd brought my old Polaroid camera, though I knew the chances of getting a decent shot in the dark were virtually 0. On the 6th night, the creature didn't appear, and I felt both relieved and disappointed. That was when I realized I was becoming obsessed. The thought should have concerned me more than it did. Instead, I found myself researching the area during my days off, digging through local newspaper archives and county records. The land where Highway 20 now runs had been inhabited by Kalapuya tribes for thousands of years before white settlers arrived. Timber Ridge, the hill they'd leveled for the highway, had been sacred to them, a place where spirits were said to cross between worlds. I found a brief mention in a 1973 newspaper article about the highway construction. Local tribal elders had protested the destruction of the hill, claiming it would disturb something that should be left alone. The highway department had dismissed their concerns as superstition and proceeded with the project. 2 weeks after construction was completed, 3 separate drivers reported seeing strange animals crossing the highway at night near mile marker 117. The reports were filed away and forgotten. Armed with this information, I modified my approach. Instead of simply driving through, I started parking on the shoulder about a quarter mile before marker 117, turning off my engine and headlights, and waiting. The first few nights yielded nothing but cramped legs and growing frustration. Then I heard the sound. It started as a faint crackling, like someone walking on dry leaves, but sharper, more brittle. It took me 3 nights to identify it properly. The sound of frozen grass breaking under pressure. The dew that settled on the roadside vegetation each night would freeze solid by 3 a.m., creating a crystal coating on every blade and stem. The crackling always came from the same spot, the forest edge about 50 yards before the leveled section. It would last for maybe 10 seconds, a steady progression that suggested something moving through the undergrowth, breaking the frozen vegetation with each step. Then silence. Then the crossing. Once I'd identified the pattern, I started timing it. 15 seconds between the first crack of frozen grass and the moment the creature burst from the forest. Every time. Like clockwork. I bought a digital voice recorder and a small infrared camera, the kind hunters use for trail monitoring. Setting up my equipment became a ritual. Park the truck, deploy the camera on a tripod, aimed at the crossing point, start the recorder, wait. The infrared camera never caught anything. Whatever crossed that highway either didn't emit enough body heat to register, or it moved too fast for the camera's motion sensors to lock onto. But the audio recorder captured everything. The crackling approach, 15 seconds of silence, then a whisper of disturbed air as something passed by. I played those recordings over and over, analyzing every nuance. The crackling footsteps, if that's what they were, followed an odd rhythm. Not the regular 1, 2, 3, 4 of a quadruped's gait, but something more like 1, 2, 1, 2, as if the creature moved both right limbs together, then both left limbs, like a bound rather than a run. But that was impossible. No terrestrial animal moves that way at speed. I started bringing a thermos of coffee to keep myself alert during the vigil. The caffeine made me jittery, hyper-aware of every small sound in the forest around me. Branches creaking in the wind, the distant hoot of owls, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. Except there was no wind on those nights, and I never heard the owls or rustling creatures until after the crossing had occurred, until after that unnatural silence broke and the forest remembered how to breathe again. 3 weeks into my surveillance, I made a discovery that changed everything. I'd been reviewing the audio from the previous night's session when I noticed something I'd missed before. In the 15 seconds between the crackling approach and the crossing, there wasn't complete silence. There was something else. A low, rhythmic sound, almost below the threshold of hearing. I isolated the sound and amplified it, running it through audio software I'd downloaded specifically for the purpose. What I heard made my skin crawl. Breathing. Not the rapid panting of an animal in motion, but slow, controlled breathing. In and out, with the deliberate rhythm of something at rest. Something waiting. The creature wasn't running across the highway. It was pausing at the forest edge, breathing calmly, then making its crossing with that impossible liquid grace. The breathing suggested intelligence, deliberation, purpose. I started having dreams about those woods. In them, I would walk along the forest edge near mile marker 117, searching for the source of the crackling sounds. The trees would grow thicker as I went deeper, their branches intertwining overhead until no starlight could penetrate. Behind me, I could hear my own footsteps on the frozen grass, but ahead of me, I could hear other footsteps keeping pace. In the dreams, I never caught up to whatever was walking ahead of me, but I could sense it watching me, evaluating me. Sometimes I would wake with the feeling that something had been standing at the foot of my bed, breathing that same slow, measured rhythm I'd captured on my recordings. I started checking the locks on my doors before bed, then checking them again an hour later, then installing motion sensor lights around my property. My supervisor at the mill asked if I was feeling all right. I'd been making mistakes, forgetting routine procedures, arriving at work with dark circles under my eyes. I told him I was having trouble sleeping, which was true enough. What I didn't tell him was that I was no longer sure if my insomnia was caused by my nocturnal highway vigils or by the growing certainty that something was watching my house at night. On a Thursday in early November, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of parking before mile marker 117, I would position myself after the crossing point and wait to see where the creature went after it reached the other side of the highway. I found a logging road about half a mile past marker 118 and backed my truck into the tree line, giving me a clear view of the highway while keeping myself hidden. At 2:45 a.m., I turned off the engine and waited. The crackling started on schedule, faint but audible even from my new position. 15 seconds later, I saw it. A pale streak moving across the dark asphalt with that fluid, impossible speed. But from this angle, I could see where it went after crossing. Instead of disappearing into the forest as I'd assumed, it continued parallel to the highway, moving through the trees with the same unnatural grace, following me. The realization hit me like ice water. The creature wasn't simply crossing the highway. It was pacing my truck as I drove. Every night, at exactly the same location, it would emerge from the forest and run alongside me for perhaps a mile before vanishing back into the woods. But that raised new questions. How did it know when I was coming? How did it time its appearances so precisely? And why had it continued the pattern even when I wasn't driving through, but was instead parked and waiting? Unless it wasn't following my truck at all. Unless it was following me. I started varying my schedule, leaving work early or staying late to throw off the timing. It didn't matter. At exactly 3:00 a.m., regardless of whether I was driving through or parked and watching, the creature would make its crossing, as if it was keeping an appointment that had nothing to do with my presence on the highway, or everything to do with it. The recordings I'd made revealed another disturbing pattern. The background sounds of the forest, the subtle acoustic fingerprint of a living ecosystem, changed in the minutes leading up to each crossing. Birds would stop calling, small animals would cease their rustling. Even the insects would fall silent, as if every living thing in the area sensed the approach of something that didn't belong, something that made the forest itself hold its breath. I began to wonder if the highway department had been right to ignore the tribal elders' warnings. Maybe some things should be left undisturbed. Maybe Timber Ridge had been leveled to create a crossing point, not for traffic, but for something else entirely. The thought should have made me pack up my equipment and find a different route home. Instead, it made me more determined to document whatever was happening. I upgraded my camera equipment, bought more sensitive audio gear, started keeping detailed logs of weather conditions and atmospheric pressure readings. I was no longer investigating a strange animal. I was conducting a scientific study of something that shouldn't exist. On the night of November 15th, everything changed. I'd positioned myself in the usual spot, equipment ready, coffee growing cold in my thermos. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and my breath formed small clouds in the still air. At 2:58 a.m., I started the recorder and aimed the camera. The crackling began on schedule, but this time it was different, louder, more extensive. Instead of the usual 10-second approach, the sound of breaking frozen vegetation continued for nearly a minute. Whatever was making the sound was moving more slowly, more deliberately. Then, in the silence that followed, I heard something new. Footsteps on asphalt. Not the whisper of disturbed air I'd been recording, but actual footsteps. Measured, careful, deliberate. And they were getting closer. I peered through the viewfinder of my camera, but the infrared display showed nothing. The highway remained empty, a ribbon of gray in the electronic darkness, but the footsteps continued, growing clearer with each step. They stopped directly in front of my position. For perhaps 30 seconds, I sat frozen in my truck cab, watching the empty highway while listening to the sound of something breathing just beyond my windshield. The same slow, controlled breathing I'd been capturing on my recordings, but now it was close enough to fog the glass. Then I heard my name. Not spoken aloud, but somehow communicated directly into my consciousness. A voice that sounded like wind through dry leaves, like the creaking of ancient wood, like the settling of old bones. Why do you watch? The question seemed to come from inside my own head, but I knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't my own thought. Something was speaking to me. Something that knew I'd been documenting its nightly crossings. I tried to answer, but my throat had closed up. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the camera steady. You disturbed the crossing. The voice carried a weight of age that made my bones ache. This wasn't some forest animal I'd been observing. This was something far older, far more aware than I'd imagined. The path was opened when they broke the hill. Each night we cross. Each night you watch. This cannot continue. The breathing stopped. The presence I'd felt pressing against my truck vanished like smoke. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was expectant. I sat there until dawn, but nothing else happened. No crackling in the forest. No whispered crossing. No sense of being observed. The next night I came back anyway. The creature didn't appear. Nor the night after that, or the night after that. For 2 weeks I maintained my vigil, but mile marker 117 remained quiet. The forest sounds had returned to normal. The unnatural silence that had preceded each crossing was gone. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt abandoned. Without the nightly encounters to document, I found myself obsessively reviewing my recordings, searching for clues I might have missed. I enhanced the audio, isolated different frequency ranges, played the sounds backward and at different speeds. In one recording, buried beneath layers of static and ambient noise, I found something that made my blood run cold. A second voice. Not the ancient wind-dry voice that had spoken to me that final night, but something else. Something that sounded almost human, but wrong in subtle ways. It was speaking during one of the 15-second silences, but in a language I didn't recognize. The syllables were harsh, guttural, filled with consonants that seemed to scrape against each other. I ran the recording through translation software, but got no matches. The language didn't correspond to any known tongue, living or dead. But as I listened to it over and over, I began to understand. It wasn't a language at all. It was an attempt at human speech made by something that had only heard humans talking from a distance. Something that was trying to mimic the cadence and structure of human communication without understanding the meaning. Something that was learning. That realization sent me back to the highway, but not to mile marker 1 and 17. Instead, I drove the entire route between Cottage Grove and Salem, stopping at every mile marker, listening for the sound of crackling grass. I found it at mile 98, then at mile 131, then at mile 156. The crossings had spread. Each location showed the same pattern. Flattened grass where something had emerged from the forest, a path across the highway too wide for any normal animal, and patches of disturbed vegetation on the opposite side. At each site, I could hear that same slow, controlled breathing if I listened carefully enough. But there was something else. At the newer crossing sites, I found footprints. Not paw prints or hoof marks, but impressions that looked almost human. Almost, but not quite. The proportions were wrong. Too long, too narrow, with what appeared to be extra joints in places where human feet don't bend. The prints led away from the highway into the forest, but they also led toward the road from the opposite direction. Two sets of tracks, one approaching and one departing, but made by the same feet. Whatever was crossing the highway wasn't just traveling from one side to the other, it was making round trips. I followed one set of tracks as far as I could, using my flashlight to illuminate the forest floor. They led deeper into the woods, past fallen trees, and over moss-covered rocks, following no trail that I could discern. After about a mile, they simply ended at the base of a massive Douglas fir that had to be over 200 feet tall. The tree showed signs of recent disturbance. Deep gouges in the bark, starting about 8 feet off the ground and spiraling upward as far as my flashlight beam could reach. Something had climbed this tree, and recently. I aimed my light upward, trying to penetrate the canopy, but the branches were too thick to see through. Above me, in the darkness between the needles, I could hear that familiar breathing. Slow, controlled, patient, watching. I backed away from the tree, keeping my light aimed upward, but I couldn't see anything in the branches. The breathing continued until I was nearly back to the highway, then stopped with an abruptness that suggested I'd moved beyond some invisible boundary. When I got home that morning, I found muddy footprints on my porch. The same elongated, wrong-jointed prints I'd found in the forest. They led from my driveway to my front door, then around the side of the house to the window of my bedroom. I called in sick to work and spent the day installing security cameras around my property, motion sensors, floodlights, an alarm system that would wake the dead if anything larger than a raccoon got within 50 feet of my house. That night, for the first time in months, I didn't drive to mile marker 117. Instead, I sat in my living room with a baseball bat across my knees, watching the feeds from my security cameras. At exactly 3 a.m., every camera went dark simultaneously. The motion sensors stayed silent. The floodlights remained off. But through my living room window, I could see something moving in my yard. A pale shape, low to the ground, circling my house with that same liquid grace I'd witnessed on the highway. It paused at each window, and though I couldn't see clearly through the glass, I could hear that slow, controlled breathing on the other side of the panes. When it reached my bedroom window, it stopped. For 20 minutes, it remained there, breathing steadily while I sat paralyzed in my chair. Then, as abruptly as it had arrived, it was gone. The security cameras flickered back to life, showing nothing but empty yard and the normal shadows of night. In the morning, I found new footprints, not just around my house this time, but leading up to every window. At my bedroom window, the prints were deeper, as if whatever had made them had been standing there for a long time. Pressed into the soft earth beneath the window was something else, a perfect handprint, human-shaped, but with fingers too long and joints too numerous. In the center of the palm was a symbol scratched into the dirt, a series of intersecting lines that meant nothing to me, but somehow filled me with dread. I took pictures of everything, then spent the day researching the symbol online. I found no matches in any database of known writing systems or cultural markers, but buried deep in an academic paper on Pacific Northwest indigenous petroglyphs, I found something similar. The paper described cave paintings found in the Cascade Mountains, made by unknown artists thousands of years before any known human settlement. The paintings depicted tall, thin figures with elongated limbs crossing between two worlds through a gap in a mountain. The researchers who discovered the paintings had dated them using carbon analysis of the pigments. They were over 10,000 years old, older than any known human presence in North America. According to the paper, local tribes had oral histories about the paintings, but they refused to discuss them with researchers. The few details that had been shared suggested the figures in the paintings weren't meant to represent humans at all, but something else that had crossed over from another place. Something that had been crossing for far longer than humans had been around to witness it. I closed the laptop and sat in my kitchen, staring at the photos I'd taken of the handprint beneath my bedroom window. The symbol scratched in the dirt seemed to shift and writhe in the digital image, though I knew that was impossible. That night, I didn't bother with the security system. Whatever was visiting me had already demonstrated that electronic surveillance was useless against it. Instead, I sat in my bedroom chair and waited, baseball bat in my hands, for whatever was going to happen. At 3 a.m., I heard the front door open. I hadn't heard footsteps on the porch, hadn't heard the lock being turned or the doorknob being tested, but I could hear the soft creak of hinges as the door swung open, then the whisper of bare feet on my hardwood floors. The footsteps moved through my house with the confidence of someone who knew the layout intimately. Down the hallway, past the kitchen, toward my bedroom. They stopped outside my door. "You have been watching for 2 months," came that wind-dry voice. "Now we watch you." The door opened, though I'd locked it. In the doorway stood something that might have been human if you squinted and didn't look too closely. It was tall, pale, and moved with joints that bent in ways that made my eyes water. Its face was a suggestion of human features arranged incorrectly, as if someone had described a person to an alien, and this was their best attempt at recreation. The crossing was disturbed when you began watching. The path became uncertain. We had to learn new ways. It stepped into my room, and I could see that its feet were exactly the shape of the prints I'd found. Too long, too narrow, with extra joints that allowed them to grip the floor like hands. You taught us about watching, about waiting, about learning patterns. The thing that looked almost human tilted its head, studying me with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Now we cross in many places. Soon, we will not need to cross at all. It reached into what might have been a pocket and what might have been clothing. Though the distinction was unclear, when it withdrew its hand, it was holding something small and dark. A piece of bark from the Douglas fir I'd found in the forest. Carved into its surface was the same symbol I'd found scratched in the dirt beneath my window. "A gift," it said, placing the bark on my nightstand. "So you will remember that some things should not be watched." It turned and walked out of my room, down the hallway, and out my front door. I heard the door close softly behind it, and then silence. I sat in my chair until dawn, but it didn't return. The next morning I called my supervisor and gave 2 weeks' notice. I told him I'd found a job closer to home, which was true in a sense. I'd found work at a sawmill in Salem, eliminating my need to drive Highway 20 at night. But as I packed my surveillance equipment away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. The creature had said the crossings were spreading, that they were learning new ways. What if my 2 months of observation had taught them more than just my patterns? What if I'd taught them about human behavior, human weaknesses, human fears? What if, by trying to prove that something impossible was real, I'd helped it become more real than it had ever been before? I still live in Salem. I still drive Highway 20 occasionally during the day, when the sun is high and the forests look like nothing more than collections of trees. But I take the long way around at night, even though it adds an hour to any trip. Because sometimes, on the edges of those other routes, I hear the sound of frozen grass crackling under unfamiliar feet. And sometimes, in my rearview mirror, I see pale shapes keeping pace with my truck from the tree line. The crossing at mile marker 117 was just the beginning. They're learning to cross everywhere now, and I think they're learning to cross more than just highways. Story 13. The first time I saw her, I thought I was dying. 3:15 a.m., according to the digital clock's angry red glow. My eyes had snapped open without warning, that jarring awakening that leaves your heart hammering against your ribs like it's trying to break free. The duplex was old, built in 1923, the landlord had mentioned with pride, as if the age somehow justified the rent, and it settled constantly. Groans and creaks were the soundtrack of our nights, but this felt different. She stood between my closet and the hallway door, perfectly still. The darkness had weight here, thick and viscous, but her silhouette was darker still, human-shaped but wrong somehow, like a photograph's negative burned into reality. I tried to speak, tried to call out to Marcus in the next room, but my throat had closed to a pinhole. When I finally managed a whispered hello, she didn't respond, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge my existence at all. Instead, she began to dissolve. It wasn't dramatic, no Hollywood special effects or theatrical vanishing. She simply became less solid, less there, until the darkness swallowed her completely. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a stress hallucination. Work had been brutal lately. 60-hour weeks debugging code that seemed to actively resist my efforts. Sleep deprivation could explain anything. I might have forgotten entirely if Marcus hadn't brought up his dream 3 days later. We were in the kitchen, him nursing his third cup of coffee while I scrolled through my phone, when he mentioned it almost casually. A basement room he'd never seen before, wooden crate in the corner, someone crying inside it. The figure was curled into an impossible shape, he said, sobbing without making sound. When he'd tried to approach to help, the crying had stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the weeping. My phone slipped from my fingers, clattering against the scarred Formica countertop. Marcus looked up sharply. "You okay, man?" I couldn't explain why his dream unsettled me so deeply. We shared a duplex, not dreams. But something about his description, the way his voice had grown thin and distant while telling it, made my skin crawl. That afternoon, we decided to check the basement. The stairs were steeper than I remembered, each step groaning under our weight like they were protesting our descent. The basement smelled of damp concrete and something else, something sweet and rotting that made my nose wrinkle. Marcus swept his flashlight beam across the space, illuminating forgotten furniture draped in dust-heavy sheets, cardboard boxes labeled in faded ink, the ancient furnace crouching in the corner like a sleeping giant. No wooden crate anywhere. But there were marks on the main support beam. Deep gouges in the wood, parallel lines that looked almost like fingernails had scraped them. The marks were fresh, the wood pale and clean where something had clawed. "Were these here before?" Marcus asked, running his finger along one of the scratches. I didn't answer because I didn't know. The basement had always felt wrong to me, a space I avoided whenever possible. Now, staring at those marks, I wondered if my avoidance had been instinctive rather than arbitrary. That night, I woke at 3:15 again. She was there, in the same spot, same perfect stillness. This time, I managed to sit up, managed to keep breathing while she dissolved into nothingness. In the morning, I found scratch marks on my nightstand. 4 parallel lines, shallow but unmistakable. Marcus had woken at 3:15 too. He'd dreamed of the basement again, but this time the crying had been clearer. A woman's voice, he thought, though he couldn't be sure. The sound had seemed to come from inside the wooden crate and from everywhere at once. We started keeping a log. It was Marcus's idea, approaching the situation with the methodical precision of his engineering background. Time of occurrence, duration of experience, environmental factors, emotional state beforehand. What we discovered was a pattern that made no sense, and perfect sense simultaneously. The apparitions, that's what we started calling them, needing a clinical word to maintain distance, only happened when we slept on the left side of our respective beds. When I moved to the right side, nothing. When Marcus tried the same, his basement dream stopped, but the marks appeared anyway, as if our positions during sleep somehow synchronized us with whatever lived in the duplex's shadows. We began experimenting, moving furniture, switching rooms, even sleeping in the living room. The results were consistent and terrifying. Left side meant contact, right side meant nothing. The duplex seemed to have a magnetic north, and we were the needles being pulled toward it. 3 weeks into our documentation, I found Marcus sitting at the kitchen table at dawn, staring at his notebook with hollow eyes. "I think it's getting stronger," he said without looking up. The previous night, his dream had changed. Instead of observing the crying figure from a distance, he'd been inside the crate with her, pressed against wooden walls that smelled of old blood and fresh dirt, listening to sobbing that came from his own throat. When he'd tried to look at his companion, she'd had no face, just smooth skin where features should have been. My own encounters were evolving too. The dark figure had begun lasting longer before dissolving, and twice I'd caught glimpses of details that shouldn't have been visible in the darkness. A dress that might have been white once, long hair that moved without any breeze, hands that seemed to reach for something just outside my vision. But the most unsettling development was the synchronization itself. We were beginning to wake at the same time even when sleeping on the right side of our beds. 3:15 a.m. had become our shared witching hour, pulling us from sleep like a cruel alarm clock we couldn't shut off. The duplex was training us. That thought arrived unbidden one afternoon while I stood in my bedroom, staring at the space between the closet and door where she appeared. The house was old, had seen decades of tenants, countless lives played out within its walls. What if we weren't the first to experience this? What if the duplex had been teaching people to see, to dream, to align themselves with whatever needed witnessing? I found myself researching the building's history, digging through city records and newspaper archives. The duplex had changed hands frequently, most tenants staying less than a year. No dramatic incidents, no reported deaths or disappearances, just a steady turnover that suggested people left quickly once they understood what living here meant. Marcus was conducting his own investigation, focusing on the basement's history. He'd discovered that the space had been modified several times over the decades. Walls moved, sections sealed off. The current layout didn't match the original blueprints, suggesting someone had been trying to contain or redirect something. Our sleep experiments became more aggressive. We tried staying awake during the 3:15 window, but exhaustion would claim us anyway, pulling us under at the exact moment when the veil grew thin. We attempted sleeping together in the same room, hoping shared vigilance might provide protection. Instead, we shared dreams, basement and bedroom blending into a single nightmare space where crying figures dissolved and reformed endlessly. The scratch marks were appearing daily now, not just on furniture but on walls, door frames, even the bathroom mirror. Always 4 parallel lines, always shallow enough to dismiss as accidental damage. The duplex was marking its territory, or marking us. 6 weeks after my first sighting, I woke to find Marcus standing in my doorway at 3:15 a.m. But it wasn't Marcus. The thing wearing his face smiled at me with his mouth, but its eyes were wrong, too dark, too deep, like looking into the basement crate from his dreams. When I blinked, it was gone, leaving only the memory of that terrible smile and the sound of crying from somewhere inside the walls. I found the real Marcus in his room, sleeping peacefully on the right side of his bed. When I woke him, he insisted he'd been dreaming of me standing in his doorway with someone else's eyes. The duplex was learning to use us against each other. We stopped switching sides after that. The experiment had taught us too much, shown us possibilities we weren't prepared to understand. But the knowledge was already embedded, the pattern established. 3:15 a.m. remained our appointment with whatever lived between the walls, and avoidance only delayed the inevitable. Last night, I found myself standing in the basement without remembering how I'd gotten there. The support beam's scratch marks had multiplied, covering the entire surface in a frenzy of parallel lines. In the corner where Marcus had dreamed of a wooden crate, the concrete floor showed stress fractures arranged in a perfect rectangle. Something had been pressing up from below. This morning, I discovered new scratches on my arms. 4 parallel lines, shallow but unmistakable. Marcus found similar marks on his back, positioned exactly where someone might claw while trying to climb out of a confined space. The duplex is almost finished with us now. I can feel it in the way the shadows move during daylight hours, the way every sound echoes strangely, as if the walls have learned to listen. We've been training for weeks, learning to see and dream and wake at precisely the right moments, learning to become whatever the duplex needs us to become. Tonight, we'll both sleep on the left side of our beds, not because we're brave enough to face what comes next, but because we no longer have a choice. The house has aligned us, synchronized us, prepared us for whatever lies in the space between dreaming and waking. At 3:15 a.m., when the crying starts and the dark figure appears, we'll finally understand why the duplex needed 2 witnesses, 2 dreamers, 2 people willing to be shaped by its requirements. The only question left is whether we'll remember being ourselves tomorrow, or if we'll wake up as something else entirely, something the duplex has been patiently teaching us to become. The scratches on my arms are getting deeper.